Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's book, Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Uh, Chapter 3 is titled The Materialist Dialectic. I'm going to have this on YouTube, I believe, as chapter 14 of the series of the book of 19, just because, putting the parts into the title would be a pain in the ass, so I'm putting them up as if they don't have parts. But this is technically chapter 13 of, chapter 3 of part 2 of the book. And this chapter is titled The Materialist Dialectic. In the foregoing chapters, we have been engaged in examining the dialectical materialist conception of matter. In the course of this, it has appeared that dialectical materialism considers matter to be essentially mobile. Motion represents an essential attribute of matter. The term, quote, motion, here being understood in its widest sense as change of any kind whatever. We must now take a more searching look at the nature of the motion so conceived. As has already been made clear, dialectical materialism is firmly opposed to the vulgar materialist and mechanistic point of view in its insistence that the course of motion in matter gives rise to qualitative changes therein. The motion is conceived, therefore, as an ascending process whereby matter raises matter's self to ever higher forms of existence. The theoretical justification for the emergence of new and ever higher qualities is held to be provided by the dialectic itself, and that it shows how qualitative changes are brought about in matter in the course of its evolution. It must be noted beforehand that the term, quote, dialectic has no very precise connotation in Soviet usage. This is in keeping with the account of the concept outlined above, which is broad in the extreme, including as it does, quote, the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society, and thought, end quote. Hence, it has come about that in Soviet philosophy, quote, dialectic often has precisely the same meaning as the concept of a, quote, dynamic, or even simply a, quote, historical approach to reality, in contrast to a static view thereof, which is designated as, quote, metaphysical in character. Quote, metaphysics thereby becomes a collective term for all systems opposed to dialectical materialism, though these may often have little to do with metaphysics proper. Where, then, are we to discern the essence of the materialist dialectic? Is it to be found, perhaps, in the celebrated triad of thesis, antithesis, thesis? Hegel himself hardly considered this triad to be anything more than the external aspect of the dialectic. Still more so is this the case with Lenin. Quote, no other role remains for the triads than as a lid in a skin, end quote. Lenin's own attempt to define the essential elements of dialectic resulted, as we have seen, in a list of 16 items. The views of Soviet philosophy on this subject were long governed by Engels' mode of treatment, which summed up the essence of the materialist dialectic in three basic laws: the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, the law of the mutual interpenetration of opposites, and the law of the negation of the negation. Until the appearance of Stalin's essay on dialectical and historical materialism, this formulation of the essence of the materialist dialectic was common property in Soviet philosophy, with the solitary exception that Engels' second law was placed first, in deference to the overriding importance attached by Lenin to the unity of opposites as an explanation of the motion in the world. The significance of this first law by the new reckoning lies in the fact that it is held to account for the origin of motion in things and in the world at large. Motion accordingly is not to be attributed to an external mover lying outside of things. Still less does the explanation of motion in the world as a whole require the postulate of a, quote, first mover, existing outside the latter. The origin of motion in things in the world is held to lie, rather, in the inner, quote, contradictions residing in the very nature of every single thing and phenomenon as such. These contradictions struggle for release and thereby set the thing in motion. The business of the second law is therefore to explain how this motion gives rise to the emergence of new qualities, essentially different kinds of being. It is supposed that up to a certain point the motion has the character of a purely quantitative addition or subtraction, but that once the quantitative change goes beyond this limit, conditioned as it is by the nature of the object in question, the mere alteration of quantity gives place to a change in quality, and a new characteristic emerges by way of a quote, leap, which signifies in the terminology of dialectical materialism that the thing is essentially altered and becomes something different. This law is held to provide philosophical justification for the evolutionist thesis of dialectical materialism by showing how it could come about that in the course of the world's process of development, life should have emerged from the development of inorganic matter, and mind and consciousness in turn from that of the organic. Stalin's essay on dialectical and historical materialism sets the matter out in an altogether different fashion. In place of Engels' three basic laws of the materialist dialectic, Stalin lays down four, quote, principal features of the Marxist dialectical method, end quote. 1. The general connection between phenomena in nature and society. 2. The movement and development in nature and society. 3. Development of a transition from quantitative changes into qualitative changes. 4. Development as a struggle of opposites. Stalin omits the, quote, law of the negation, end quote. Until his death, this arrangement was slavishly followed by Soviet authors. It still underlies the textbook on dialectical materialism edited by Alexandrov, which appeared only in 1954. As already noted, it was only after Stalin's death that voices were to be heard, urging the abandonment of this scheme and a revival of the law of the negation. But since we still lack any new account of the theory of the materialist dialectic, which can claim to be an interpretation of the official point of view, the solution adopted in the present work will be in the nature of a compromise. In our opening section, we shall deal with the first two laws formulated by Stalin as, quote, principal features, end quote, of the materialist dialectic. The two sections that follow will be concerned with the pair of laws to be found in both Stalin and Engels, and the last section of this chapter will then be devoted to Engels' law of the negation, which Stalin omitted to mention. New section. Section 1. Stalin's account of the first two, quote, principal features, end quote, of the Marxist dialectical method. It may be noted in advance that Stalin mistakenly refers to principal features of the Marxist dialectical method. In point of fact, all four of the propositions he lays down are not just methodological guiding principles for the proper study of reality, but themselves, in the primary sense, already assertions about reality. Quote, contrary to metaphysics, end quote, says Stalin, expounding the first principal feature of the Marxist dialectical method, quote, dialectics does not regard nature as an accidental agglomeration of things, of phenomena, unconnected with, isolated from, and independent of each other, but as a connected and integral whole in which things, phenomena, are organically connected with, dependent on, and determined by each other. Quote, the dialectical method therefore holds that no phenomenon in nature can be understood if taken by itself, associated from surrounding phenomena, inasmuch as any phenomenon in any realm of nature may become meaningless to us if it is not considered in connection with the surrounding conditions, but divorced from them, and that vice versa, any phenomenon can be understood and explained if considered in its inseparable connection with surrounding phenomena as one conditioned by surrounding phenomena, end quote. In this first principal feature, Stalin formulates the ideas underlying numbers 2, 7, 8, and 10, especially of the 16, quote, elements of dialectic distinguished by Lenin. But even in Engels, we already find this notion of universal connection throughout the world as a presupposition of the dialectical approach. Quote, the first thing that strikes us in considering matter and motion is the interconnection of the individual motions of separate bodies, their being determined by one another. They're being determined by one another, end quote. Stalin's statement, which is no more than the pathetically solemn enunciation of a platitude, is customarily supported by the production of a whole string of more or less plausible examples from the fields of science and social life in order to create the philosophically untutored reader or hearer the impression that this endorsement of a single thesis constitutes a dazzling scientific confirmation of dialectical materialism as a whole, a procedure we have often had occasion to observe in action already. It is pointed out that the totality of nature represents a vast interconnected whole, whose individual departments exhibit a manifold mutual dependence on one another. Thus the earth itself exists not as an isolated body in space, but in common with the other planets as part of the solar system. The latter again as part of the galaxy, and so forth. The work of the Russian biologist K.A. Timiryazev on photosynthesis has likewise brought out the connection between inorganic and organic matter. But it is not only in the world as a whole that such pervasive interconnections are manifested. In every single thing and phenomena, a similar set of elements may be distinguished. Standing in interconnection and reciprocity one with another, moreover, all such elements in things and phenomena are bound together in such a way that change on the part of any one of them gives rise to change in the others. As dialectical materialism sees it, this has a special significance for Darwin's theory of evolution. Engels makes a direct appeal to this law of functional dependence in organisms in order to elucidate the laws of evolution from ape to man. The employment of tools, the labor performed by their aid, led in the course of evolution to the perfecting of the hand, and parallel with this the foot became adapted to the needs of an erect gait. Both must then have given rise to the subsequent changes in other parts of the organism. The same reciprocal dependence is also observable in social life. Society, too, represents an organism whose elements are in mutual dependence on one another. It is just this that is brought out by the materialist conception of history when it points to the means of production as the basis on which the whole of social development everywhere depends. Now, quote, metaphysics is accused of ignoring all this. Thus, quote, exponents of the idealist philosophy of so-called, quote, existentialism maintain, for example, that there is no sort of lawful connection among phenomena, that historical facts can only be described as accidental and meaningless. Even where reactionary bourgeois philosophy has succeeded in advancing to the concept of wholeness, as in the, quote, holism of Smuts, quote, the field marshal of the English army for many years oppressed the South African peoples, end quote. This concept is distorted in that the wholeness of the organism is attributed to the presence of the special, quote, factor of wholeness, end quote, which differs in no essential respect from a creator God. There is naturally no neglect of the opportunity so presented for adverting likewise to the social and political significance of these bourgeois creeds. The denial of law in general, and of social law in particular, is allegedly intended solely for the purpose of conjuring out of existence the laws governing the decline of the capitalist order and the emergence of a new socialist society. The second, quote, principal feature of the Marxist dialectical method, end quote, is formulated by Stalin as follows, quote, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that nature is not a state of rest and immobility, stagnation and immutability, but a state of continuous movement and change, of continuous renewal and development, where something is always arising and developing, and something always disintegrating and dying away. The dialectical method therefore requires that phenomena should be considered not only from the standpoint of their interconnection and interdependence, but also from the standpoint of their movement, their change, their development, their coming into being and going out of being, end quote. Stalin. Of the 16 elements in Lenin's account of dialectics, this formula corresponds above all to the third, and is precisely this element that has been responsible for the dialectical materialist habit of forthwith equating, quote, dialectical and, quote, dynamic. This can be seen in Engels, for whom dialectics is always that which grasps, quote, things and their images, ideas essentially in their interconnection, in their sequence, their movement, their birth and death, end quote. Engels. This point of view is represented by Engels and all his successors as opposite to that of, quote, metaphysics. Indeed, in dialectical materialist usage, the postulation of unchanging entities, and more generally the disregard of movement and change in nature and history, is reckoned the essence of metaphysics. Thus, in regard to the observation of nature, Leonov cites as examples of such, quote, metaphysics, Voltaire, who believed the marine fossils discovered in the Alps to have been left there by travelers, or Linnaeus, who took them for an idle game on the part of nature, or again, the Mendel-Morgan theory of an unchanging inheritance, localized in genes. In social theory, similarly, quote, metaphysical, end quote, views are exemplified by the utopian socialists, whose socialism was built on the idea of an unchanging, quote, human nature, end quote, by bourgeois sociology, which imagines the doctrine of private property to be an eternally given, quote, natural phenomenon, end quote, and more especially by the opinions of present-day reactionary bourgeois philosophers and historians who look upon capitalism not as a transitory phase, but as an eternal and unchangeable form of production. The political significance of all these theories is said to be merely that of undermining the popular belief in a better social order in the future, and of persuading the public that the present order can never be shaken. Quote, this means that in present-day society, the metaphysical view of development and the dialectical conception opposed to it reflect the radical conflict between the bourgeois world outlook and that of the proletariat. End quote. Lenin. I believe that's Lenin. Again, I'm not sure. These citations are hard to follow. So maybe it's not Lenin. I think it is, though. In setting up motion and development as a general law, dialectical materialism has no wish to discount the element of rest, which lends a relative degree of constancy to things and phenomena. Without such an element of constancy, there would indeed be no qualitative definiteness in the world and no specific concrete subjects of development. But the materialist dialectic recognizes rest and constancy as relative merely, not as something, quote, absolute. Let me repeat that sentence. I'm fucked up. But the materialist dialectic recognizes rest and constancy as relative merely, not as something, quote, absolute. To think otherwise would be, quote, metaphysics. Since, therefore, everything in the world is in a state of movement and development, it must naturally be of crucial importance to become acquainted with the laws of this development, and this is precisely where the Marxist dialectic comes in. From this point of view, it is first and foremost the foundation of a scientific knowledge of the past. The foundation of a scientific knowledge of the past. The first thing required in the investigation of any occurrence is the historical mode of approach. Only by virtue of its connection with preceding developments does any event become intelligible. Inquiry into the past should not, however, be confined merely to establishing and describing the facts. What matters, rather, is to discover the circumstances and meaning of events. Nor again should a scientific investigation of history consist in accumulating facts in order to pass judgment on the past from the standpoint of the present. It is a question rather of making clear which classes were in conflict with one another, and thereby determining the content of history at any given period, and of evaluating the activities of these classes from the standpoint of the subsequent historical developments. Here it becomes evident that classes which are nowadays reactionary may have played a progressive part in earlier times. And finally, the historical scrutiny of development must abstract from everything that is irrelevant or contingent in events in order to bring out the decisive factors, the major line of development. This, too, can only be done with the aid of the dialectic, which points the way to a quote, generalization of historical events. The theory of any given subject for dialectical materialism is nothing other than its history in a generalized form. Thus, in the sequence of categories of capitalism, for example, As stated by Marx in the book Capital, one may see reflected the historical development of capitalism. All sciences are at bottom concerned with the history of their development in a generalized form, so it is in astronomy, in geology, in chemistry even, and so on. By its discovery of the laws of development, the Marxist dialectic also provides, however, the wherewithal for a scientific prediction of future developments. The wherewithal for a scientific prediction of developments. And for communism, this is by far its most important achievement. The possibility of scientific prediction is based on knowledge of the laws of development, but above all on knowledge of the fact that events repeat themselves, which represents an essential aspect of developmental law. From the extreme historicism outlined above, we might have expected, rather, that emphasis would be laid on this unique and unrepeatable character of history. Stalin, however, surprisingly declares, quote, "History repeats itself, though on a new basis," end quote. Stalin. Science can therefore disclose a certain invariance in development, which is expressed in the form of law. Quote, "Law is the permanent, the enduring element in phenomena," end quote. Hence, law may give expression not only to what was or already is the case, but also in broad outline to the future situation emerging from present tendencies of development. Lenin points out that it was this lawfulness of historical development which gave Marx the opportunity of showing that communism, quote, has its origin in capitalism, that communism develops historically from capitalism, and that communism is the result of the action of a social force to which capitalism has given birth. There is no trace of an attempt on Marx's part to conjure up a utopia, ... Marx treats the question of communism in the same way as a naturalist would treat the question of the development of a new biological species, if he knew that such and such was its origin and such the direction in which it was changing, end quote. Lenin. In order to achieve a sound prognosis of future development, it is particularly important to distinguish correctly in the present between what is arising and what is in process of dying away. This is not always easy, since the novel element often appears quite insignificant at the outset and can easily be overlooked. Quote, "The dialectical method regards as important primarily not that which at the given moment seems to be durable and yet is already beginning to die away, but that which is arising and developing even though at the given moment it may appear to be not durable. For the dialectical method considers invincible only that which is arising and developing," end quote. Stalin. I believe that's Stalin, at least. That the element of novelty in the complex of developmental factors may be the more readily identified, the Soviet authors provide a number of criteria for its recognition. To begin with, novelty represents a negation of the old. The struggle between old and new, therefore, signifies in the first place a denial of the one and an affirmation of the other. But between old and new in this process there prevails a specific interconnection of law, for the old which is negated does not change into anything else you please, but into a quite specific new thing, whose character is an outcome of its own past. A is transformed not into any completely arbitrary not A, but into some other quite definite thing, a specific definite B. Every phenomenon has its own perfectly specific manner of undergoing negation. A grain of wheat does not give rise to an animal, nor does the embryo of a horse become a wolf. Negation thereby shows itself to be internally contradictory in character. Negation contains within negation's self a moment in which the old is conserved. A further distinctive feature of the new is its progressive character, i.e. the fact that it aims at reaching a higher level. Where am I? Reaching a higher level of development. Thus, even capitalism at the time of its inception was by origin progressive and new in relation to the feudalism which preceded it. And finally, the essentially typical feature of novelty is the very fact of its invincibility, governed as this is by the laws of development, i.e., by the fact that the new corresponds to newly arisen needs of social development and incorporates everything positive in the development that has gone before. The old order may sometimes put up a despairing resistance, but that, as was long ago since noted by Chernyshevsky, is precisely a symptom of the vitality of the new. Quote, is it not clear that the more brutal the means to which the old order must resort in order to preserve itself against the onset of new interests, the more plainly does it bear witness to the strength of these new interests? Brutal measures are only restored against a powerful and dangerous enemy. End quote. In his article, The Struggle Between New and Old Under the Conditions of Life in Soviet Society, Fedorov goes on to point out the essentially different character taken by this struggle in a society ridden by class antagonisms, and in the socialist classless society. In a class society, the old can only be conquered by a, quote, liquidation of the reactionary classes. In the atmosphere of moral and political unity prevailing in Soviet society, however, the conquest of the old is primarily effected by means of education, persuasion, the transformation of human consciousness, and the like. The assertions embodied in Stalin's first two, quote, principal features, namely that the things and phenomena in the world are all multiply interrelated, and all involved in a continuous process of coming to be and passing away, are obvious commonplaces, at least if one stops short, as dialectical materialism does, at the mere factual assertion, without attempting to inquire philosophically as to how such a multiplicity can also be one, and how the changeable can likewise exhibit constancy. It is precisely this last mentioned aspect that has always interested, quote, metaphysics and incited metaphysics to inquiry. As a further criticism of these, quote, principal features, we must therefore draw attention to the peculiar notion of, quote, metaphysics, which dialectical materialism exhibits in this connection. To be a metaphysician is in no way to discount the occurrence of change and decay in the empirical world, nor does to be a metaphysician imply any denial of interconnection among the changing objects of our experience. The sole concern of metaphysics is to infer in thought, beyond the world of experience, insofar as it is subject to physis, i.e., change and decay, to the realm of the inexperienceable, not to be confused with the unknowable, and thereby to penetrate into that sphere of reality where it is possible to discern the unity behind multiplicity and the constancy behind change. To this end, metaphysics begins by investigating what is common to everything real, that is to say, it views everything in its most general aspect as being and inquires into the nature, properties, and laws thereof. Thus it is metaphysics which alone makes it possible to discover the necessary connections within the manifold contiguity and succession of empirical reality, and so to establish those real connections within spatial contiguity and temporal succession, whose existence is alleged in these first two, quote, principal features of dialectical materialism. Of the second of these in particular, it may also be observed that a merely, quote, relative stability at rest, amid the absolute flux of movement and change, do not suffice to make possible the differentiation and emergence of, quote, qualitatively determinate, end quote, things and phenomena in the course of this process of development in matter. Failing the absolute validity of certain laws, such as the principle of sufficient reason, the causal law, the law of contradiction, and other equally fundamental principles, themselves in turn grounded upon unchanging essential properties of being and existence, there could be no determinacy of any kind whatsoever. We have seen, too, in the previous chapter, how dialectical materialism itself describes certain laws, such as that of the conservation of energy, as, quote, absolute and eternal, end quote, though in doing so it acts in strange contrast to its own basic principles. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm just talking. This is my dumb philosopher brain, but it seems like skepticism, um, about truth, rejection of metaphysics as a discipline, or is like seems to be like eating its own tail, right? So like a radical skeptic argument would say there is no universal truth, right? But that is a universal statement, right? And the same things about change being an essential feature of the universe, um, as such, um, is a metaphysics, and especially if you're declaring that that change is all changes within matter, you're asserting, um, you're asserting that, like you're asserting a constant truth, right? The only thing certain is change, right? Um, that's a declaration about how things are as such. The metaphysical statement. Um, New section 2. The law of the transition from quantity to quality. We have already had occasion to point out that dialectic materialism conceives of the motion dealt with in the previous chapter, not as a cyclical motion, but as having the character of development, in which elements of novelty, new qualities, are continually coming to light. Contrary to metaphysics, so Stalin formulates this third principle, feature of the Marxist dialectical method, dialectics does not regard the process of development as a simple process of growth, where quantitative changes do not lead to qualitative changes, but as a development which passes from insignificant and imperceptible quantitative changes to open fundamental changes to qualitative changes, a development in which the qualitative changes occur, not gradually but rapidly and abruptly, taking the form of a leap from one state to another. They occur not accidentally, but as the natural result of an accumulation of imperceptible and gradual quantitative changes. End quote. Stalin. The content of this law is as follows. The development of things and phenomena in the world proceeds up to a certain point in the form of a gradual, merely quantitative change, by successive addition or subtraction. But once this quantitative change advances beyond the limits set by the nature of the thing in question, a sudden shift from quantitative to qualitative change occurs. The thing ceases to be what it is and becomes something else. A new, quality makes its appearance. Quality, in dialectical materialist usage, is the essential determinacy of an object, the determinacy of its organic properties, features, and characteristics, by virtue of which it is this object and no other, and is thereby distinguished from other objects. End quote. I'm not sure who that quote is from. It says KFS in the citation. I don't know if that's Stalin or who. Quality is in the first instance something inseparable from the thing in question, indissolubly bound up with the thing, and secondly also something characteristic of the thing, peculiar to the thing alone, something which radically differentiates a given thing from every other thing. Dialectical materialism follows Hegel in distinguishing between quality, kачество, and property, svojstvo. Hegel defined quality as the, immediate determinateness of the something, end quote, whereas he reckoned the properties of an object to comprise it, its, determinate relation to other, properties given only as a mode of attitude of one toward another, end quote. Hegel. Hence, for dialectical materialism also, quality represents an inner determinateness intrinsic to the relation, whereas property signifies this determinateness in its relation to other things. A property is the manifestation of a quality through that quality's relation to another quality. End quote. B.M. Kedrov. Thus, the quality of gold, for example, is determined by gold's inner structure, whereas gold's properties, such as malleability, weight, sheen, freedom from rust, etc., depend upon this. Unlike qualities, properties are not inseparable from the object, An object may lose a property without ceasing to be what that property is. An object may lose a property without ceasing to be what that object is. Rubber, for example, loses its elasticity at low temperatures and becomes rigid and brittle like glass, but without therefore ceasing to be rubber. The category of quality is connected with that of quantity. Quote, quantity is a determinacy of objects and phenomena that is characterized by number, size, rate, degree, extent, etc. In specifying the relationship, dialectical materialism again falls back upon Hegel, who formulates the distinction between quality and quantity as follows. Quote, quality may be described as the determinate mode immediate and identical with being, as distinguished from quantity, which, although a mode of being, is no longer immediately identical with being, but a mode indifferent and external to it. End quote. Hegel. From the logic. Dialectical materialism likewise sees in quantity a, quote, external mode of the object, end quote, whose changes, at least within certain limits, have no effect upon the quality of the thing in question. Thus, whereas quality gives expression to the relative stability of the thing, its inner wholeness and unity, quantity expresses its capacity for change while leaving its qualitative determinacy undisturbed. This invariance of quality in the course of a quantitative change is but relative, however, for it extends only up to a certain limit. Once the quantitative change goes beyond this limit, there is a sudden transition in the form of a leap from the previous quality of the thing to a new one. This, quote, organic unity of qualitative and quantitative determination, end quote, is described by dialectical materialism as measure. Quote, measure denotes the limits within which quantitative changes do not evoke qualitative, end quote. The points of transition from one measure to another are referred to as, quote, nodes, end quote. This doctrine also goes back to Hegel. Quote, measure now is the immediate unity of the qualitative and the quantitative, end quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. Quote, we have here a measure relation, an independent reality qualitatively different from others. Such a being for self is also essentially a relation of quanta, and therefore open to externality and variation of quantum. It has some play within which it remains indifferent to this change, and does not alter its quality. But there comes a point in this quantitative change at which quality changes, and quantum shows itself as specifying, so that the altered quantitative relation is turned under our hands into a measure, and thereby into a new quality and a new something, end quote. For Hegel, too, the quantitative change goes on gradually, whereas the qualitative emerges, quote, per saltum, end quote. And Hegel adduces a series of examples from mathematics, from music, and above all from the field of chemistry, where such, quote, nodal lines of measure, end quote, are exemplified with a special clarity. Dialectical materialism gives Hegel the credit for having been the first to formulate the law of transition from quantity to quality, but he did so, however, in a regrettably, quote, idealist fashion, in the quantity and quality figure as determinate stages in the development of the absolute idea, but are not related to material objects of any kind. This error of Hegel's has now been corrected by the founders of Marxism, in that they have given a, quote, deeply materialist interpretation, end quote, to the Hegelian formula. Engels puts it as follows, quote, for our purpose, we can express this by saying that in nature, in a manner exactly fixed for each individual case, qualitative changes can only occur by the quantitative addition or quantitative subtraction of matter or motion, so-called energy. All qualitative differences in nature rest on differences of chemical composition or in different quantities or forms of motion, energy, or, as is almost always the case, on both. Hence, it is impossible to alter the quality of a body without addition or subtraction of matter or motion, i.e., without quantitative alteration of the body concerned. In quote. Engels. Like Hegel, Engels also finds particular confirmation of this law in chemistry, in which it celebrates, quote, its most important triumphs, end quote. Quote, and indeed the various proportions in which oxygen combines with nitrogen or sulfur, each of which produces a substance qualitatively different from any of the others, exclamation point. How different is laughing gas, nitrogen monoxide, N2O, from nitric anhydride, nitrogen pentoxide, N2O5. The first is a gas, the second at ordinary temperatures a solid, crystalline substance. And yet the whole difference in composition is that the second contains 5 times as much oxygen as the first, and between the two of them 3 more oxides of nitrogen, NO, N2O3, NO2, each of which is qualitatively different from the first two and from one another. End quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. This law is reinforced by means of a number of more or less happily chosen examples. The classic instance from physics is the periodic system of the elements, in which a change of atomic number tends also to coincide with a new qualitative state of the element. In chemistry, for example, the quantitative division of a substance below the molecular level leads to qualitative changes. Individual atoms have different properties from those of the molecule they comprise. In the field of biology, there is constant recourse to Darwin and the proof he is alleged to have given that initially insignificant quantitative changes in plants and animals eventually lead by accumulation and inheritance to the formation of new species. In the field of social theory, the reference is to Marx and his example of how a master craftsman becomes a capitalist as soon as his capital exceeds a certain level. Lenin too sees a similar transformation of quantity into quality realized in the transition from bourgeois to proletarian democracy. Quote, democracy introduced as fully and consistently as is generally conceivable is transformed from bourgeois democracy into proletarian democracy, from the state ... into something which is no longer really a state. End quote. Lenin, State and Revolution. And lastly, this law also holds good of human mental processes. Zhdanov sees it at work in the creation of Marxism. Which betokens a revolution in philosophy. Here, as in every other sort of leap, the discovery was prepared for by a previous accumulation of quantitative changes, in this particular case by the assembled findings of philosophical inquiry prior to Marx and Engels. But these then gave rise to a new type of philosophy, different in quality from all the philosophical systems that had gone before. Even nowadays, however, there are still repeated references to a less happy example originally put forward by Engels and later quoted by Stalin, namely that if a liquid is heated or cooled beyond a certain point, there is a change in the, quote, aggregate state, end quote. Kedrov does not even boggle at employing the following example. If the dimensions of a writing table say, are reduced below a certain minimum, it ceases to be a table and become a toy. It becomes a toy, I guess is how you'd actually say it. I think it's a typo. Or maybe I misread it. I don't know. Anyway, the law of the transformation from quantity to quality figures, therefore, as one of the main pillars in the philosophical edifice of dialectical materialism. It is taken to provide theoretical warrant for the assumption of an unbroken rule of transformation, operating throughout the entire course of the world process. In contrast, however, to the worldview of mechanistic materialism, there is no immediate elimination of the essential qualitative difference between the various realms of being. The atom certainly consists of electrons, but despite this, its laws are not reducible to electronic laws. So, too, The molecule is made up of atoms, but its nature is not exhausted by the laws prevailing in the atomic sphere. The same applies to the cell, the organism, mind, society, etc. In general, three main fields of reality are distinguished: inorganic matter, the organic world, where in turn the emergence of mind itself represents a transition of the highest importance, and the sphere of life. The quote forms of motion and quote governing each of these spheres are basically irreducible one to another, each retaining its own specific quality. But despite this formal irreducibility of the higher levels to the lower, dialectical materialism insists that they are genetically derived from the latter, and it is the law of the transition from quantity to quality which is supposed to provide the theoretical basis for this claim. Quantitative and qualitative changes condition two essentially different kinds of development: evolution and revolution. Quote, and so the dialectical method says that movement has two forms, the evolutionary and the revolutionary form. End quote. Stalin. It is characteristic of the first that it is gradual, whereas the second takes place in a sudden, sweeping, violent manner. Quote, movement is evolutionary when the progressive elements spontaneously continue their daily activities and introduce minor quantitative changes into the old order. End quote. Stalin. Anarchism or socialism. Both the quotes that I just read from Stalin are from anarchism or socialism. Conversely, quote, movement is revolutionary when the same elements combine, become imbued with a single idea, and sweep down upon the enemy camp with the object of uprooting the old order and of introducing qualitative changes in life, of establishing a new order. End quote. Stalin. Anarchism or Socialism, 1906/7. Evolution and revolution are mutually correlated according to law. Quote, evolution prepares for revolution and creates the ground for revolution. Revolution consummates the process of evolution and facilitates its further activity. End quote. The correlation resides, however, not only in the fact that the quantitative changes lead up to and prepare the way for qualitative ones, but also and conversely in the fact that the qualitative changes are followed by a new increase on the quantitative side. The cultivation of qualitatively new and better agricultural land also assists the production of quantitatively better crops, the breeding of new strains of cattle yields greater quantities of milk, meat, etc. The transition from quantitative to qualitative changes, therefore, implies a breach of continuity. It takes place by means of a leap. But this theory of dialectical leaps harbors a danger to the Soviet system itself. For the doctrine that all development includes a movement of both evolution and revolution lends itself to the conclusion that even the Soviet order of society must in turn be advanced by way of a qualitative dialectical leap, i.e. by a revolution in the social field, if history is not to be admitted to have come to a complete standstill. In order to avoid this conclusion, a distinction of exceptional importance was introduced into Marxist-Leninist theory by Stalin. In his letters on linguistics, where he differentiates between leaps that occur suddenly, zriv, literally a, quote, explosion or violent upheaval, and those that take place gradually, only in antagonistic forms of society does the transition from one form to another take the shape of a, quote, explosion, whereas in the development of the classless Soviet society, these, quote, leaps occur, quote, by way of a gradual accumulation of elements of the new quality and a dying away of the old one, end quote. The relevant passage in the first of these letters is outwardly most unimpressive, having the air of a casually interpolated remark, apropos, the question whether the development of language takes place by way of violent upheavals. Quote, it should be said in general for the benefit of comrades who have an infatuation for explosions, that the law of transition from an old quality to a new quality by means of an explosion is inapplicable not only to the history of the development of languages, is not always applicable to other social phenomena of a basis or superstructural character. It applies of necessity to a society divided into hostile classes, but it does not necessarily apply to a society which has no hostile classes. In a period of 8 to 10 years, we effected a transition in the agriculture of our country from the bourgeois individual peasant system to the socialist collective farm system. This was a revolution which eliminated the old bourgeois economic system in the countryside and created a new socialist system. But this revolution did not take place by means of an explosion, that is, by the overthrow of the existing government power and the creation of a new power, but by a gradual transition from the old bourgeois system in the countryside to a new system. And it was possible to do that because it was a revolution from above, because the revolution was accomplished on the initiative of the existing power with the support of the bulk of the peasantry. End quote. Stalin. Suck it, Stalin. In an article on basis and superstructure published on the 5th of October 1950, Pravda describes these opinions of Stalin's as a quote, of tremendous importance, end quote. Quote, Comrade Stalin is the first in the literature of Marxism to have shown that in the socialist society, where antagonistic classes no longer exist, the operation of a basic dialectical law, the law of transition from an old quality to a new, takes on a new form. Comrade Stalin has destroyed the vulgar notion that qualitative changes must always and under all circumstances take place by way of explosions. Comrade Stalin has shown that the law of transition from an old quality to a new by means of explosions only applies to a society divided into hostile classes. But this law by no means applies to a society where there are no antagonistic classes, end quote. Stalin's, quote, solution of the problem of the fateful dialectical, quote, leaps amounts therefore to this, that the new term, quote, explosion is now introduced in place of, quote, leap. Leaps are still allowed, moreover, it is only, quote, explosions that are forbidden. In a report titled The Further Development of Dialectical and Historical Materialism in J.V. Stalin's Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, delivered by Alexandrov at a session of the Academic Council of the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences, the distinction between the old and the new types of, quote, leap is formulated as follows. In the antagonistic class society, the decisive role in the, quote, leap from an old to a new quality is taken by an initiative, quote, from below, i.e. by a revolutionary uprising among the masses, accompanied by furious resistance on the part of the ruling classes. Hence the characteristic feature of this leap, the fact that it develops into a, quote, explosion, involving the liquidation of the old order of society and its replacement by a new one. Matters are otherwise in the classless Soviet society. Quote, in effecting the transition from one stage of development of socialist society to another, higher one, from an old quality to a new, the leading part is played by the initiative from above, the initiative of the Soviet state. The leading part is played by the initiative from above, the initiative of the Soviet state. The masses of the people actively support such a revolutionary initiative from above, ... And it is precisely this which gives rise to the peculiarity of the transition occurring under such conditions, from an old quality to a new, namely that here the leap no longer takes on the character of an explosion, and so a liquidation of the established order of society, and cannot possibly do so. And it is precisely this which gives rise to the peculiarity of the transition occurring under such conditions from an old quality to a new, namely that here the leap no longer takes on the character of an explosion and a liquidation of the established order of society, and cannot possibly do so, end quote. This is doubtless enough to provide a formal solution of the difficulty. The only trouble is that having ceased to be a, quote, explosion, the, quote, leap also loses its sudden character, takes on the character of a gradual transition, and therefore ceases to be a, quote, leap at all. There is yet another, quote, deepening of previous understanding which Alexandrov ascribes to Stalin's letters on linguistics, this time concerning the relationship of evolution and revolution, and typically enough it again tells in favor of continuity. Stalin has here rectified an erroneous account of social development to be found in a number of works on historical materialism, whereby the individual stages in the development of society are made to appear as separated by an absolute break, and the history of society reduced to a succession of isolated situations having no connection one with another. In contrast to this, Stalin has made it clear that although the development of particular bases and superstructures certainly occurs by way of leaps and breaches of continuity, there are other social features, notably those of technology and language, whose development does not follow the irregular progress of basis and superstructure, but rather ensures by its continuity the continuous character of the history of social development. The theory of the different kinds of leap has since become one of the generally prescribed doctrines of dialectical materialism. Quote, the Marxist dialectical method teaches us to approach the analysis of leaps in a concrete historical manner and to recognize their qualitative diversity and variety. End quote. Kedrov has devoted a special study titled Gradualness as a Form of Transition from an Old Quality to a New, to an analysis of changes of this type. Gradualness, he argues, should not be attributed only to quantitative changes. It is also a feature of many qualitative transitions, and this not only, quote, as a form of quantitative preparation for the leap, an evolutionary prelude to revolution, but also as a form in which the leap or revolution takes place, a form of qualitative change, end quote. Kedrov illustrates the point with a series of examples from nature and history. In astronomy, cosmogonical theories are based on the idea of a gradual evolution among cosmic objects and a correspondingly slow transition to qualitatively new conditions in geology and especially in soil science. Gradual leaps of this sort are to be found in the theory of Dukachev and Williams. In biology, such qualitative transitions occur in the form of new species. In a later work, Kedrov appeals to this fact in defending Darwin against the charge of, quote, flat evolutionism, end quote. Those who object to Darwin in this score are confusing gradual qualitative transitions with purely quantitative transitions. In the fields of anthropology and physiology, another example is provided by the process of human evolution. In the development of language, quote, explosions are altogether absent, and so too in the history of technology, science, and production. B.M. Kedrov. Above all, however, Kedrov endeavors to prove that the transition from socialism to communism is a slow and gradual process of this kind. He demonstrates this by an analysis of the three, quote, basic conditions, end quote, for the transition to communism, as laid down by Stalin in his last book, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. But when reference is made to the gradual transition to a new quality in the course of social development under socialism, this must not be taken to imply that the process will necessarily be a slow one. On the contrary, quote, thanks to the many special features and advantages of a socialist system, the productive forces are developing there at an accelerated rate, end quote. Kedrov, or I'm not sure who actually says that. The true purport of all these speculations is really quite obvious. The revolutionary sting in the law of transition from quantity to quality is to be drawn, and in the interest of preserving the existing Soviet system, the accent is again to be placed increasingly on the, quote, continuity of the developmental process. The, quote, leaps are no longer permitted to assume the character of, quote, explosions, i.e., as Alexandrov sees it, they no longer imply the overthrow of the existing state power, and if for the sake of theory revolutions continue to be envisaged in the future, that what is intended is that they shall consist only of revolutions, quote, from above, conducted by the established regime. And in order to anchor this newly discovered conservatism of continuity still more firmly into the nature of social development, It is pointed out that the sphere of operation of the dialectical leaps is by no means so extensive as might appear, since there are factors in social life, technology, and language which remain wholly unaffected by this law. The emergence of new qualities in the course of the developmental process is also bound up with a belief in their progressive character, i.e., the optimistic conviction that development takes its course from the lower to the higher and better. Here, too, the quote, metaphysicians are of a different opinion, more especially the adherents of a cyclical theory of development in nature and society, which brings forth nothing new but merely repeats the stages already traversed before. This was the view of Giambattista Vico at the beginning of the 18th century, who supposed all societies and civilizations to run through the same cyclical course of youth, maturity, and decay. In modern bourgeois ideology of the epoch of imperialism, Oswald Spengler, the quote, ideologist of the German imperialist and intellectual forerunner of fascism, end quote, represents a similar point of view, namely that society must run through three stages in the course of its development: growth, maturity, and decadence. And despite all these such notions, dialectical materialism proclaims its belief in progress, in the idea, quote, that the process of development should be understood not as a simple repetition of what has already occurred. Let me repeat that. Quote, the process of development should be understood not as movement in a circle, not as a simple repetition of what has already occurred, but as an outward and upward movement, as a transition from an old qualitative state to a new qualitative state, as a development from the simple to the complex, from the lower to the higher, end quote. There is no need on that account to picture this progressive development as an uninterrupted triumphal march in which there are no occasional setbacks and regressions. Just as biology is acquainted with the phenomena of so-called regressive evolution, i.e. a certain reversion to evolutionary stages already traversed, so social evolution also is familiar with periods of defeat and retrogression. Quote, the revolution normally develops not in a directly ascending line, but on a zigzag path, a series of offensives and defensives, of ebbs and flows, which in course of development steel the forces of revolution and prepare the way for their ultimate victory, end quote. Stalin, on the opposition. But in spite of all such occasional regressions, the historical development of human society represents on the whole an upward process leading finally, as by whatever devious ways, to its inevitable culmination in socialism. Quote, we live in an age when all roads lead to communism, end quote. V.M. Molotov in the piece 30th Anniversary Celebration of the Great October Revolution, 1947. The socialism which has already been realized in the Soviet Union represents, however, quote, not only a progressive stage in historical development, but also a qualitatively new system of society, end quote. Come on. What the hell is going on here, man? N. Dijhandland? It's me, Dijhandildin. In an article titled On the Distinguishing Features of the Upward Development of Socialist Society. In footnote. The liquidation of exploiting classes and of class contradictions has brought it about that even the upward development has acquired a novel character. Even this, The liquidation of exploiting classes and of class contradictions has brought it about that even the upward development has acquired a novel character, in that it now no longer pursues the earlier zigzag path of exhibits regressions, but takes the form rather of an uninterrupted advance. Quote, the most important feature of the upward development of Soviet society lies in the fact that this development is continuous in character. End quote. N. Dilden. The novel manifestation of what has hitherto been one of the most fundamental laws of the world's development, namely that the advent of the socialist order of society, that with the advent of the socialist order of society, there is no longer any discontinuity, but only a perfect continuity of social development, is exceptionally worthy of remark. In broad outline, it is held that in future there is to be nothing but a pure and unbroken ascent. This fact, this expectation that the world is to be fundamentally transformed down to its innermost laws of being, does more than almost any other to bring out clearly the messianic aspirations which underlie Marxism, and more especially Marxism in its Soviet form. The dialectical materialist law of transition from quantitative changes to qualitative undoubtedly gives expression to a situation actually to be met with in real life, namely the emergence of essential changes in the course of a gradual process of inessential change. So long, at least, as essential is understood in the everyday sense, whereby water, say, is taken to be, essentially different from, e.g., salt. In this sense, the law is by no means peculiar to dialectical materialism. We need only refer to the fact that Thomism, for example, employs a similar notion when it treats of substantial change, transformation of essence, as in many cases the result of a more or less lengthy process of accidental change. In the present state of physics, it is, however, very difficult to decide whether genuine transformations of essence, or qualitative changes as they are called in dialectical materialism, actually occur in the inorganic world, or whether this should not be confined only to the transition from inorganic to organic matter, and the various transitions of organisms one into another. Thus, a first reservation to be made against the dialectical materialist doctrine on this point is that it ought to distinguish more clearly between, qualitative and essential changes. It is certainly quite a different matter whether water is transformed into steam or whether its atoms are assimilated by an organism, for in the latter case these atoms are subjected to new laws, which, although describable in physico-chemical terms, are not explicable from them alone, whereas the differences in behavior of the individual atom inside and outside the molecular bond can be completely accounted for in terms of the quantum physical laws operative within its electronic shell. Now, it is indeed possible to find in dialectical materialism an inclination to differentiate more precisely between the qualitative distinctions separating the three great orders of reality, inorganic matter, life, and mind, and those occurring among the various phenomena within these orders, such as that between water and oxygen. This is the case, for example, in the Soviet authors, in dealing with the origin of life, refer to matter, hitherto governed solely by the physico-chemical form of motion, as having now acquired a new biological form of motion, A further distinction is often drawn in this connection, moreover, between separate chemical and physical forms of motion. Even from the dialectical materialist standpoint, it should be more consistent, therefore, to employ some terms such as essential change, to distinguish those changes in which a new structural principle emerges, form of motion, or form in general, from those in which this does not occur, as when a molecule is split into atoms. Even if it should be possible in principle to account for molecular properties entirely in terms of the quantum physical laws prevailing in the subatomic field, i.e. to reduce them to quantitative changes, there might still be some justification, perhaps, for speaking of a qualitative distinction between the molecule and the molecule's atoms, and between molecules of different substances, insofar, that is, as there are specific laws still operative in the macrophysical field, in contrast to the quantum physical laws of microphysics, and insofar as it is possible, despite the statistical character of the latter, to arrive at truly dynamical laws in the macrophysical sphere. This leads us to a further and more important reservation in regard to the dialectical materialist doctrine on this subject. The main thing it aims at in this law is to provide some sort of philosophical possibility that in the course of the world's evolution, the quote, higher phenomena should have arisen of their own accord from the quote, lower. Now the explanation for this is said to be that, at certain quote, nodal points, the hitherto purely quantitative changes necessarily become qualitative. This may indeed happen in qualitative transitions involving no quote, essential change, in the sense just explained, as when a radioactive element having one quality changes into another of a different quote, quality by emission of alpha particles. But even quote, qualitative changes of this kind are not always capable of occurring spontaneously on their own without the intervention of a quote, efficient cause. Unquote. To return to the example so frequently cited in this connection about the change in aggregate state, water does not spontaneously change into steam of its own accord, but requires a cause to make it do so, namely a source of heat. Moreover, there is an absolute necessity for such influence on the part of an extra-mundane cause as soon as it is a matter, not just of changes within the same order of reality, but of ascending to a higher one, as with the emergence of life or conscious mentality. In dealing with this law, the Soviet authors proceed as if the supposition that life, for example, has arisen spontaneously from inorganic matter were a scientifically established fact, to be taken as a starting point in any philosophical treatment of the question, and laid down as a datum for, quote, philosophical generalization, end quote. We shall see in Chapter 5 that Soviet science is far from having proved any such proof. From the philosophical point of view, however, it must be urged against this thesis that it involves a repudiation of the principle of causality, which dialectical materialism is elsewhere resolute in defending against a variety of indeterministic tendencies in modern physics itself. For this principle not only demands a cause in general for the emergence of anything new, but also an adequate cause, and if we were to assume a spontaneous generation from the less perfect, the quote, gain in perfection would lack any corresponding cause, and must in fact have arisen out of nothing. But to postulate such a generation would be to credit the less perfect, which is incapable of creating out of nothing, with a genuine power of creation, and this is impossible. To ascribe such creative power to an infinite perfect world creator, as is done in theism, where the greatest wealth of being is situated at the world's beginning, is a notion which straightway lends itself to completion. So to set what is poorest in being, lifeless, mindless matter, at the world's beginning, and to endow it with genuine creative power, is an assumption that can only be filled out in idea, but not in thought, for it would mean surrendering the basic principles on which all thought is founded. The causal law, for example, the principle of sufficient reason and the law of contradiction, and with their abandonment there would be equal justification for maintaining any proposition whatsoever, and all science and philosophy would be rendered impossible. In conclusion, we shall venture to refer to a matter which is not without a certain flavor of irony. Engels sought to exclude the philosophy of nature from the system of dialectical materialism, remarking contemptuously that it replaced the real but as yet unknown interconnections in nature by ideal fancied ones. But now it is the dialectical materialists themselves, armed with the law of transition from quantity to quality, and following moreover in Engels' own footsteps, who plunge on impatiently like bold philosophers of nature, ahead of the advance of the positive sciences, for they not only inform us of the fact that higher beings have arisen by evolution from lower beings, but are also already prepared to tell us how this has come about, namely by the transformation of quantity into quality. New section, section 3, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. Among his, quote, principal features of the Marxist dialectic, Stalin assigns only fourth place to the struggle of opposites, though Engels lists it in second position, and although in accounts of Soviet dialectical materialism published before 1938, it always figured first. Quote, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that internal contradictions are inherent in all things and phenomena of nature, for they all have their negative and positive sides, a past and a future, something dying away and something developing, and that the struggle between these opposites, the struggle between the old and the new, between that which is dying away and that which is being born, between that which is disappearing and that which is developing, constitutes the internal content of the process of development, the internal content of the transformation of quantitative changes into qualitative changes. Quote, the dialectical method therefore holds that the process of development from the lower to the higher takes place not as a harmonious unfolding of phenomena, but as a disclosure of the contradictions inherent in things and phenomena, as a, quote, struggle of opposite tendencies which operate on the basis of these contradictions. End quote. Stalin. Dialectical and historical materialism. But though Stalin actually puts this law in position, it is still credited even nowadays with supreme importance. But though Stalin actually puts this law in last position, it is still credited even nowadays with supreme importance, quote, as the main feature of the whole dialectical process of development, end quote. Though the law of transition from quantitative changes into qualitative may have made it clear how the evolutionary process gives rise to new and higher qualities, it still remains to be explained from whence, in general, the entire process of development derives its origin, and what it is that sets it in motion. To account for this, and to do so without calling on the aid of a supernatural cause, a supernatural, quote, first mover, is the point and purpose of the thesis concerning the struggle of opposites. Dialectical materialism solves the problem of where to look for the origin of motion in the world by conceiving of all motion as ultimately a, quote, self-movement, whose origin is supposedly derivable from the, quote, internal contradictions, end quote, lying hidden in each individual thing. According to Lenin, there are essentially two views of development to be found in the history of philosophy. Quote, the two basic or two possible or two historically observable conceptions of development, evolution, are development as decrease and increase, as repetition and development as a unity of opposites, the division of the one into mutually exclusive opposites, and their reciprocal relations, end quote. On the first view, things undergo no real interchange, but remain at bottom always the same. Their whole development, whether we are dealing with plants or animals, man or society, is reducible to a purely quantitative addition of various properties and aspects which they already possessed beforehand to a more limited extent, or at least in embryonic form. The weakness of this conception lies in its inability to account either for the origin of motion or the emergence of novelty in the process. But this is precisely what the second view does provide for. Quote, in the first conception of motion, self-movement, its driving force, its source, its motive remains in the shade, and this source is made external, God, subject, etc. In the second conception, it is to the knowledge of the source of, quote, self-movement, that intention is chiefly directed. The first conception of lifeless is lifeless, poor, and dry. The second is vital. The second alone furnishes the key to the, quote, self-movement, end quote, of everything in existence. It alone furnishes the key to the, quote, leaps, to the, quote, break in continuity, to the, quote, transformation into the opposite, end quote, to the destruction of the old and the emergence of the new, end quote. For Lenin, therefore, and for dialectical materialism generally, motion in the world is not to be thought of in mechanical terms that would call for the assumption of an origin lying outside it, and eventually lead to the further assumption of a, quote, first mover, a divine first cause. No, motion is to be understood in terms of, quote, self-movement, whose source must be looked for in the internal oppositions or contradictions inherent in all things and phenomena. In this, Lenin really does nothing more than follow the lead of Engels in giving a materialistic turn to the Hegelian doctrine of, quote, contradiction and, quote, self-movement. Hegel deals with the theory of contradiction in the second book of his Science of Logic, and it made an extremely lasting impression on Lenin's mind. Quote, but it has been a fundamental prejudice of hitherto existing logic and of ordinary imagination that contradiction is a determination having less essence and immanence than identity. But indeed, if there were any questions of rank, and the two determinations had to be fixed as separate, contradiction would have to be taken as the profounder and more fully essential. For as opposed to identity is only the determination of the simple immediate, or of dead being, while contradiction is the root of all movement in life, and it is only insofar as it contains a contradiction that anything moves and has impulse and activity. End quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. On entering this passage into his notebook, Lenin embellishes it with heavy strokes in the margin and underlined the reference to contradiction as the root of all movement, so as to emphasize it further still. Thus, already in Hegel, we find the notion of a certain primacy of contradiction over identity, which held such a fascination also for the Russian revolutionaries of an earlier generation. No less a person than Mikhail Bakunin conceived his business to prove the primacy of the negative to the positive in the dialectic, and his celebrated essay titled Reaction in Germany in the left Hegelian Deutsche Jahrbucher with the fiery summons, quote, let us put our trust, therefore, in the eternal Spirit, who shatters and destroys only because he is the unfathomable, and eternally creative source of all that lives. The desire to destroy is itself a creative desire, end quote. Bakunin. Lenin also took over the concept of self-movement from Hegel. Quote, and similarly, internal or self-movement or impulse in general is nothing else than the fact that something is itself, and is also deficiency or the negative of itself. In one and the same respect, abstract self-identity has no life, but the fact that the positive in itself is negativity causes it to pass outside itself and to change. Something, therefore, has life only insofar as it contains contradiction, and is that force which can both comprehend and endure contradiction, end quote. Lenin. Excuse me, no, that's not Lenin, that's Hegel. It looks like. I don't know who that is, actually. It seems a little too comprehensible for Hegel. I don't know. The concept of, quote, self-movement here established and expounded by Hegel inspired Lenin with ardent enthusiasm. After having copied this passage, okay, so it was Engels. Hegel. It was Hegel. Lenin added, quote, movement and, quote, self-movement, and, quote, parenthesis, NB, this, exclamation point, an autonomous, bracket, independent, and bracket, spontaneous, internally necessary movement, in parenthesis, quote, change, quote, movement and being alive, end quote, quote, principle of all self-movement, end quote, quote, impulse, end quote, instinct, towards, quote, movement, and, quote, activity, opposite to, quote, dead being. Who would have thought that this is the core of, quote, Hegelism, the abstract and abstruse, dreary absurd, question mark, parenthesis, dreary absurd, question mark, in parenthesis, business of Hegelizing. This core has had to be discovered, grasped, quote, rescued, peeled out, purified, and Marx and Engels have actually accomplished it, end quote. Quote, metaphysics is declared to be incapable of grasping such a conception of motion. It can only envisage motion as beginning with a push from outside, and this leads in turn to the assumption of a first mover, an intervention on the part of a divine first cause, who set the world as a whole in motion by means of an incursion effected from without, as Newton required him to do. The French materialists took a similar view of motion and thereby admitted the logical impossibility of assuming a first mover, however much they themselves rejected the idea. And metaphysics, moreover, is incapable of rising to this conception of self-movement because it cannot grasp the existence of real contradictions inherent in things, and sides with Düring in describing such assumptions as, quote, the apex of absurdity, end quote. Quoted by Engels in Anti-Düring. The impossibility of real contradiction also supplies the basis for Zeno's celebrated paradoxes against the possibility of motion. A moving body can only be in one place at any given moment, but this means that it is at rest. Now, since this contradiction is impossible, motion itself is impossible. Various 20th century Russian, quote, metaphysicians, such as P. Struve and V. Chernov, attempted to resolve this antinomy by asserting that there is actually no contradiction at all. If one divides up the whole course traversed by the moving body into a series of minute sections or points, the moving body occupies a point in space at each single point in time. At one moment it is at one point, at the next moment it is at the next point, and so on. Lenin repudiated this sort of argument. It derives motion which is continuous from a sum of states of rest. A deviant form of the, quote, metaphysical concept of motion is held to be represented by the, quote, equilibrium theory, Comte, Spencer, Düring et al., which considers a state of rest to be the normal situation and ascribes to motion only a transient occasional significance. The source of motion on this view is the struggle between conflicting forces externally opposed to one another. The aim of motion, the restoration of equilibrium. The same is also supposed to hold good in the field of social development, where this equilibrium theory is exploited by opportunists in order to preach the reconciliation of class antagonisms. The dissemination of such fallacies in Russia is especially laid by Soviet philosophy at the door of Bukharin, who relied on the equilibrium theory in accepting the possibility of peaceful coexistence between the socialist and capitalist sectors of the economy, and advised waiting until, quote, the larger peasants have grown up into socialism, end quote, Bukharin. Now, in opposition to all these, quote, metaphysical, end quote, systems, dialectical materialism maintains that motion in the world has the character of self-movement. Its essence consists in the fact that it rests upon, quote, real contradictions, end quote, which find concrete expression in the fact that every individual thing and phenomenon is internally divided against itself, and contains different aspects and elements in mutual opposition to one another, which impel the thing into change and motion. Self-movement accordingly implies, in the first place, the presence of real contradiction, which, quote, is objectively present in things and processes themselves, and so to speak appears in corporeal form, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Against Düring, who had roundly described this notion as absurd, Engels argues that if we fail to run up against contradictions only so long as we, quote, consider things as static and lifeless, each one by itself, alongside of and after each other, we find certain qualities which are partly common to, partly diverse from, and even contradictory to each other, end quote. Engels. But which betoken no contradiction in the things themselves, since we find them distributed among different objects, but the position is altered, quote, as soon as we consider things in their motion, their change, their life, their reciprocal influence on one another, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. And on adopting this, quote, dialectical mode of approach, we immediately encounter real contradictions inherent in the things themselves, quote, motion itself is a contradiction. Even simple mechanical change of place can only come about through a body at one and the same moment of time being both in one place and in another place, being in one and the same place and also not in it. and the continuous assertion and simultaneous solution of this contradiction is precisely what motion is, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. So too Lenin, quote, motion is the union of continuity of space and time and discontinuity of space and time. Motion is a contradiction, a union of contradictions, end quote. Lenin. But this applies not only to spatial movement, but also to motion of any kind in the sense of change in general. All development is therefore a contradiction, implying as it does a union of mutability and constancy. Quote, when anything comes into being, it does not yet exist, for it is only beginning to do so. But if we were only to say that, it would not be correct, for once it has started, it is already beginning to be, i.e. already exists. This means, therefore, that of anything coming into being, we must maintain simultaneously both that it exists and that it does not exist. In coming to be, there is a simultaneous union of being and not being, i.e. of opposites which directly exclude one another, end quote. Motion and contradiction are therefore inseparable from one another, and since, as we have seen already, motion is to be understood in its broadest sense as becoming in general, and also appears, in this dialectical materialist conception of it, as an essential attribute of matter, which is to say of being in general, the presence of internal contradictions thereby becomes an ontological law of the highest and most general kind. Real contradictions constitute the innermost essence of things. Quote, it is, in its proper meaning, dialectics is the study of contradiction in the essence of objects as such, end quote. Lenin. Or I believe that's Lenin. Anyway. In the concrete, these inner contradictions are revealed in the fact that everything, phenomenon or process, is divided within itself and has two opposite sides. Such pairs of opposites are to be met with in every sphere of reality. In mathematics, positive and negative quantities, differential and integral. In mechanics, action and reaction. In astronomy, the determination of planetary motions by centrifugal and centripetal forces. In physics, the atom of a complex unity of opposites. Electrons repel one another, and so do protons. While electrons are attracted by them, positive and negative electricity and magnetic polarity are further examples of opposites bound together in unity. But it is in the field of biology especially that life presents itself as a, quote, contradictory process, end quote, of this type, featuring a continual cycle of accretion and destruction, assimilation and dispersal. These two opposite tendencies, the building up of cells on the one hand and their decay on the other, constitute the basis, the condition for the process of life. Quote, life is therefore also a contradiction which is present in things and processes themselves, and which constantly asserts and solves itself, and as soon as the contradiction ceases, life too comes to an end and death steps in. End quote. I'm not sure, but I believe that's Lenin. Not certain, though. Similarly, in Pavlov's physiology of higher nervous activity, the activity in question represents a unity of the phenomena of excitation and inhibition. In the sphere of thought, also, Engels remarks, quote, that, for example, the contradiction between man's inherently unlimited faculty of knowledge and its actual realization in men who are limited by their external conditions and limited also in their intellectual faculties, finds its solution in what is, for us at least, and from a practical standpoint, an endless succession of generations in infinite progress, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Shit, I fucked up earlier. That quote that I said might have been Lenin's, the one that says, that was actually Engels. Sorry about that. And that last quote that I just said just now is Engels, Anti-Düring. In the field of social life, there is the contradiction between productive forces and relations of production in the capitalist order of society. giving rise to crises and class struggles. Even such social phenomena as war participate in this all-pervading dualism, for it is the opinion of Soviet philosophy that war, too, like everything else in life, has a positive side as well as a negative side. The Second World War, for example, served to exhibit governments, states, and parties in their true colors, and also operated as a sort of trial by ordeal and security test for the Soviet system itself. Dialectical materialism lays stress on the fact that this twofold interrelation of opposites is to be conceived, not, quote, eclectically, end quote, as a mere conjunction or succession, but dialectically in the sense that these opposites are so far entwined that one cannot exist without the other. Not only do they not exclude one another, they oppose and reciprocally condition each other. In the capitalist order of society, bourgeoisie and proletariat are in hostile opposition, yet they are so tied up with one another in the economic structure of capitalism that the one class represents a condition for the other's existence. Lenin also sums up the dialectical relationship of contradiction in yet another fashion as representing a transition from one member of the opposition into the other. Quote, dialectics is the theory of how opposites can be and commonly are identical, how they become so, under what conditions they remain identical when changing into one another. End quote. Lenin. But although, Lenin. But although opposites or real, quote, contradictions, end quote, form a dialectical unity, Lenin expressly emphasizes that in the dialectical relationship of material presupposition and exclusion so constituted, it is the conflict rather than the unity which takes first place. Quote, the unity, coincidence, identity, resultant of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. End quote. Lenin. It is noteworthy that here too Stalin's letters on linguistics have recently brought about a shift of emphasis in favor of the stable factor of unity. Did I say Lenin for the last quote? The last quote was Lenin. Sorry, spacing out. It is noteworthy here too Stalin's letters on linguistics have recently brought about a shift of emphasis in favor of the stable factor of unity. As we have already seen earlier, Stalin is unequivocally of the opinion that language is a bond uniting the whole of society, which ought not to serve any one class to the detriment of the remainder. In this connection, he then goes on to maintain that in general, the class struggle does not imply a disintegration of society. So long as capitalism exists, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are bound together and made dependent on each other by a mass of economic ties. The removal of these ties would mean a cessation of all economic production, and hence the collapse of society and of the classes themselves. Quote, consequently, however sharp the class struggle may be, it cannot lead to the disintegration of society. End quote. Stalin. When Stalin's letters on linguistics were discussed at a meeting of the Academic Council of the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences, V.P. Chertkov amplified this by observing that Lenin's words on the conditional character of unity had lately been misunderstood by a number of philosophers. It had clearly been forgotten, quote, that in dealing with the law of the unity and conflict of opposites, the unity of opposites represents a philosophical category just as much as the struggle between them. End quote. The hushing up of unity and the absolute status accorded to the struggle of opposites does not lead, as is supposed by thinkers and revolutionaries of a primitive anarchist turn of mind, to a strengthening of the idea of development, but on the contrary makes the latter quite impossible. For if in the course of development the given unity is not continually displaced by a new one, the contradiction too remains perpetually one and the same. A deeper penetration into the course of Stalin's argument shows clearly, moreover, that this powerful emphasis on the reality of unity in no way points to any preaching of conciliation between the opposites. Footnote. More recently, too, since Stalin's death, a number of Soviet philosophers have several times been accused of leaving the, quote, unity out of the formula of the, quote, unity and struggle of opposites. End footnote. To sum up, we can do no better than cite the conception of, quote, self-movement formulated by Wolfson and Gak, G-A-K, as follows. Every phenomenon in the various orders of being contains in itself opposing elements which are mutually exclusive, and yet also presuppose and interpenetrate one another. The conflict between them conditions all development within the bounds of the unity of any given thing. A continuous accentuation of the contradiction between the opposites is always going on. Once this opposition has reached a certain level, conditioned in each case by the specific quality of the thing in question, the contradiction is resolved, and the previous quality is therefore thereupon replaced by a new one with new internal contradictions. As may easily be seen from the foregoing, the true meaning of the law of the unity and struggle of opposites consists in providing a philosophical justification for the social phenomena of class war and revolution discovered by Marx. What was originally regarded by Marx as a law of social development has here been transformed into an ontological law of being, having universal application. But in the process, this law also becomes a thorn in the side of Bolshevik theory itself, for if it possesses the universal character of a general law of being, it must now apply in the social field, not only to capitalism but also to socialist and communist orders of society. Their development too must proceed at the instigation of inner contradictions, unless we are prepared to conclude that with the onset of communism, all development completely ceases, and that human history itself, and not merely the prologue thereto, has come to an end. There was indeed, therefore, to draw the sting from this law and discover new incentives to social development, new forms of the conflict of opposites, which should at the same time be a conflict no longer. This is affected by the distinction of antagonistic from non-antagonistic contradictions. In the discussion on Alexandrov's book, Zhdanov asserts, among other things, in our Soviet society where antagonistic classes have been eliminated, the struggle between the old and the new, and consequently the development from the lower to the higher, proceeds not in the form of struggle between antagonistic classes and of cataclysms, as is the case under capitalism, but in the form of criticism and self-criticism, which is the real motive force of our development, a powerful instrument in the hands of the party. This is incontestably a new form of movement, a new type of development, a new dialectical law, end quote. Zhdanov. The law of the unity and conflict of opposites therefore operates differently in a society composed of antagonistic classes to the way it does in a society where class antagonisms no longer exist. Quote, antagonistic contradictions, end quote, are taken to be, quote, contradictions founded on the irreconcilable interest of hostile classes, groups, and forces, end quote. Whereas, quote, non-antagonistic contradictions, end quote, are those, quote, which have no hostile classes with directly conflicting interests behind them. Contradictions not on fundamental issues but on current points of detail, end quote. The first include the conflicts between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or between the various imperialist powers. During the period of transition in the Soviet Union, such antagonism existed between the workers and smallholders on the one side, and the urban bourgeoisie and the wealthier peasant class, the kulaks, on the other. Prior to the establishment of socialism in the Soviet Union, there were non-antagonistic contradictions between the workers and the smallholders who still possessed some property, and since that time there have also been other such conflicts, between the more and the less progressive elements, for example, or between men's socialist way of life and certain survivals of capitalism in their consciousness. All contradictions can be resolved only by a struggle, but while the first type can be dealt with only by the violent methods of war or revolution, it is characteristic of the second that they do not necessarily have to develop to the point of hostile opposition, and that the struggle between the parties does not rise to the level of open conflict. The question of contradictions in the socialist society has lately been the subject of an animated discussion among the Soviet philosophers, touched off by an article in Vопроsi Philosophie by T.S.A. Stepanyan, Contradictions in the Development of Socialist Society and the Means of Resolving Them. Stepanyan begins his account with a definition of the concept of, quote, contradictions, which he differentiates from various fallacious conceptions of it. Quote, contradiction is a division within unity and a struggle between the various internally connected aspects and tendencies of objects, and phenomena in the objective world. End quote. Difference, contrariety, and conflict are separate manifestations of contradiction. Every concrete contradiction goes through three stages in its development: origin, growth, and resolution. Stepan allows for the possibility of conflict in both antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. It is the error of the, quote, no conflict theory, end quote, that it fails to take this into account. But he considers that there is a most essential difference between these two types of conflict. Those in antagonistic forms of society express the fundamental economic and political interests of social groups. They are more enduring and are resolved in violent collision. In non-antagonistic societies, however, they relate not to the economic interest of whole groups, but to the attitude of the individual towards society, or to the other individuals. They are therefore very easily resolved, thanks to the unity of the people as a whole. For the special case of contradiction within the socialist society, Stepan Yam distinguishes them accordingly to the following three features. A. They are non-antagonistic. B. They are contradictions of growth, occurring throughout the whole formation of the socialist order, and not merely at the beginning, as is the case with capitalism. C. They do not lead, as happened under previous social orders, to an eventual collapse of the production relations of the existing socialist and communist order, but to a continual perfecting of the same. These three traits are paralleled by the specific manner in which contradictions are resolved under socialism. A. They are settled, not by violent upheaval, quote, explosion, but gradually by means of a planned development of social production. B. They are disclosed and dealt with, not by way of the class struggle, but through criticism and self-criticism, and the establishment of new driving forces for the development of Soviet society. C. They are eliminated, not as in capitalism by a revolutionary destruction of the existing order through mass pressure from below, but by degrees, without, quote, explosions, initiative proceeding from above, from party and government. So far as the socialist mode of production is concerned, it too, according to Stepan Yan, is subject to the general law of contradiction between the tendency to continuous advancement on the part of the productive forces and the tendency to relative inertia and self-sufficiency on the part of the relations of production. But whereas under capitalism the result is that at a certain stage in the development of the productive forces, they necessarily become fettered by the existing relations of production, this no longer happens under socialism, thanks to social ownership and correct leadership, based on an understanding of the laws of economic development. Quote, the progressive advance of Soviet society towards communism gives assurance that impending contradictions in the development of the socialist mode of production will be promptly discovered and disposed of, end quote. Stepan Yan also raises the question as to what constitutes the fundamental contradiction in socialist society. Contrary to the opinion of certain Soviet authors who had sought to dismiss this issue, he argues that socialism, like capitalism, also has its underlying contradiction. It is generally agreed in Soviet circles that under capitalism, it is the contradiction between the social character of production and the private character of ownership. Under socialism, according to Stepan Yan, it is the, quote, contradiction between the limitless expansion in the requirements of the population as a whole and the level of development attained at any given time in the production of material and cultural goods, end quote. It is this contradiction which provides a continual spur to economic development. The intention here is to keep in line with the Stalinist formulation of the basic economic law of socialism. Quote, the securing of the maximum satisfaction of the constantly rising material and cultural requirements of the whole of society through the continuous expansion and perfection of socialist production on the basis of higher techniques, end quote. Stalin. It would carry us too far to enter into detail into the various rejoinders provoked by Stepan Yan's article. Much of what was said has more to do with historical materialism and political economy, and many of the criticisms and amplifications brought forward, though often of great interest, are more in the nature of personal opinions. The whole controversy appears to be still too fluid to allow even the statements generally agreed upon to be treated as representing the main current in Soviet philosophy. As it is, Stepanyan's observations coincide, at least in broad outline, with what have long been generally accepted points of view. Among non-antagonistic contradictions in the socialist Soviet society, chief importance is still assigned to the antitheses between town and country and between mental and physical labor. Only under capitalism, according to Stalin, did these antitheses genuinely obtain. Under present conditions in the Soviet Union, it is more a matter of, quote, essential distinctions, where the mutual relations of town and country are concerned. It is the prevalence in industry of communal ownership of the means of production, whereas group ownership is still the rule in agriculture. But with the transfer to communal ownership in agriculture, the quote essential distinction between town and country will also be overcome, and all that will remain is an inessential distinction, exemplified in the difference of working conditions. The same applies to the division between mental and physical labor, where with the raising of the cultural level of the manual worker, the quote essential difference still remaining is supposed to disappear. In accordance with this doctrine of the non-antagonistic nature of the contradictions in socialist society, Soviet authors are continually taking issue against supporters of the, quote, no-conflict theory. This is an attitude particularly widespread among writers and artists and founded on the belief that in Soviet society, the only possible difference lay between good and better, and hence that there could be no contradictions or conflicts between the old and the new. This theory led to neglect of the growth factor and of the struggle against the survivals of capitalism and human consciousness, and thus had a harmful effect. It has already been mentioned that the chief method of revealing and overcoming non-antagonistic contradictions consists in, quote, criticism and self-criticism, end quote. It therefore becomes one of the most important driving forces in the development of Soviet society. Three others are referred to by Stalin in his report to the 18th Party Congress, in which he draws a comparison between capitalist society, with its division into exploiting and exploited classes, and Soviet society with its workers, peasants, and Soviet intelligentsia united in friendly collaboration. Quote, it is this community of interest which has formed the basis for the development of such motive forces as the moral and political unity of Soviet society, the mutual friendship of the nations of the USSR, and Soviet patriotism. End quote. Stalin. The solution of criticism and self-criticism was originally put forward by Stalin purely for the doings of the party, especially after the 15th Party Congress, when, thanks to the final victory over the opposition, a situation had arisen which might subsequently have exposed it to the danger of resting complacently on its laurels. Quote, what does it mean, however, to rest on one's laurels? It means to put paid to our forward advance. In order to prevent this happening, we have need of self-criticism, not the malignant and essentially counter-revolutionary criticism practiced by the opposition, but an honorable, upright Bolshevik self-criticism. End quote. A more concrete expression of criticism and self-criticism in economic life is to be found in socialist emulation, the nature of which is fundamentally different from the capitalist principle of competition. Whereas the latter betokens a struggle of every man for himself and against the remainder, socialist emulation implies a general fellowship of the community in the struggle toward common achievement and comradely assistance for the weaker brethren on the part of the stronger, thereby giving evidence of the advance of socialist consciousness. In general, the transition from socialism to communism calls not only for increased production, but also for a transformation of consciousness, a high level of, quote, communist awareness, end quote, which is itself to be attained by the way of criticism and self-criticism. Hence the enormous importance attached to criticism, particularly in the ideological field, a fact which has been sufficiently clearly manifested in the various incursions of the Central Committee upon the theoretical ideological front. Criticism and self-criticism are also of the greatest importance in life and the work of the party. This is especially connected with the fact that the Bolshevik Party is the only party and must therefore itself bear the burden of discovering its own failings. Such criticism provides a safeguard against dogmatism, against the unthinking acceptance of traditional doctrines, without testing them to see if they still answer to changed circumstances. This also applies, in Stalin's opinion, to the classics of Marxism. They too, he insists, must be regarded with a critical eye. Footnote. Quote, one cannot advance, end quote, says Stalin in reply to a letter of a certain comrade Razin. Quote, and one cannot further the progress of science without bringing critical analysis to bear on old-fashioned views and assertions on the part of certain authorities in the field. This applies not only to authorities on warfare, but also to the classics of Marxism, end quote. Stalin, cited by Leonov in the journal Bolshevik, 1947. And footnote. Lastly, criticism and self-criticism protect the tender shoots of the still emergent new against bureaucratic rough handling on the part of the old. There is far less evidence, however, for the dialectical character of the other driving forces in Soviet society. The first of these is laid down by Stalin in the past, as already mentioned, as the, quote, moral and political unity of Soviet society, end quote. By moral and political unity is meant, quote, a state of society in which there are no social antagonisms and in which social contradictions are overcome, not in the throes of the class struggle, but within the framework of a consciously directed policy carried through by the leading power in this society, the Bolshevik Party, end quote. M.B. Mitten. The next driving force referred to by Stalin is, quote, friendship of the peoples of the Soviet Union, end quote. The solution of the national question in the USSR, the blossoming of national and socialist cultures, that is, which are national in form and socialist in content, has given the mass millions of all nationalities a share in the culture and leadership of the state. Quote, there are millions upon millions of men engaged in furthering the course of historical development, and the more there are taking an active part in this development, the more rapidly and fruitfully will the process go on. End quote. M.B. Mitten. The last of the driving forces listed by Stalin as contributing to socialist development is that of, quote, Soviet patriotism. End quote. Stalin himself has given the, quote, classic definition of Soviet patriotism in his book on the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union. Quote, the strength of Soviet patriotism lies in the fact that it is based not on racial or nationalistic prejudices, but on the people's profound loyalty and devotion to their Soviet motherland, on the fraternal partnership of the working people of all nationalities in our country. Soviet patriotism harmoniously combines the national traditions of the peoples and the common vital interest of all working people of the Soviet Union, end quote. Stalin. The influence of this factor upon historical development lies in the fact that it is the source of heroism and creative energy. The victory of the Soviet army in the Great Patriotic War was no less due to this cause than were the cultural advances and the successful progress made in all spheres of life in the years after the war. It is significant that even after, quote, de-Stalinization, these incentives have remained unaltered. In his address to the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev declared it a major task of domestic politics in the years ahead to strengthen friendship among the peoples of the Soviet Union and the moral and political unity of the Soviet people as a whole, as also to educate the mass millions of the workers in the spirit of Soviet patriotism. The Communist Party itself is also reckoned among the decisive motivating forces of the Soviet society. Quote, it is impossible to grasp the effectiveness of the driving forces in socialist society without stressing the quite special role played in the development of this effect by the Communist Party. The party is the leading and guiding power in socialist society. It coordinates the effect of all the driving forces in socialist society, guides them towards a single goal, and uses them to strengthen and extend the development of the socialist order. End quote. V.F. Konstantinov. In attempting a philosophical appraisal of this basic tenet of dialectical materialism, it will be advisable to deal separately with two different questions. The problem as to whether quote, real contradictions, end quote, actually obtain in the world, and the problem as to the significance attaching to these real contradictions as the origin of, quote, self-movement, and the source of change and movement in the world. In his study, Über die Dialektische Methode, Edward von Hartmann sets out a series of typical fallacies which lead to the seeing of, quote, contradictions where none in fact exist. The commonest are as follows. A. Allegedly contradictory opposites fail to conflict because they do not characterize the subject in the same respect. B. Unity is confused with identity. C. The correlative character of concepts, e.g. cause and effect, is confused with the notion that one is subordinate to the other. What von Hartmann here observes of the Hegelian dialectic is to a very much greater extent of the dialectic of dialectical materialism. Even in the examples already given of the presence of real contradictions in the world, it will be evident that in the majority of cases there is already no contradiction at all. Often it is a matter of contrary opposites, positive and negative qualities in mathematics, or again the alleged contradictions do not pertain to the same subject. Attraction and repulsion between subatomic particles, repulsion holds between electrons, attraction between protons and electrons. Or at least not in the same respect. Growth and decay of cells in a living organism, polar opposites, north and south magnetism, and even the banal observation that a phenomenon such as war may have positive and negative consequences are likewise designated as, quote, contradictions. The confusion of, quote, contradiction with, quote, opposite gives pause even to the reviewer of Leonov's textbook, Vопроsi Philosophy, and he puts this error right by explaining that, quote, contradictions, end quote, such as that between the social character of production and the individual character of appropriation, constitute the, quote, basis of, quote, oppositions, such as that between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But this confusion between the two concepts on the part of a second or third-rate author is no longer matter for surprise when we observe how Lenin, a, quote, classic of Marxism, himself equates the concepts of, quote, unity and, quote, identity, as may be seen from his fragment on dialectics. Quote, the identity of opposites, their, quote, unity, perhaps it would be more correct to say, although the difference between the terms identity and unity is not particularly important here, in a certain sense both are correct, is the recognition, parenthesis, discovery, and parenthesis, of the contradictory, mutually exclusive, opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature, including mind and society, end quote. Lenin. In the majority of the examples adduced to prove the thesis that there are, quote, real contradictions, end quote, present in the world can therefore be excluded, there still remain the classic examples, the contradictory character of motion in space, which is supposed to lie in the fact that a body in motion both is and is not at a given, quote, here in the same moment, and the contradiction involved in all becoming generally, insofar as it is regarded as a unity of being and non-being. But in point of fact, these arguments are nothing but a repetition of the old fallacies of Zeno, directed against the possibility of motion. They consist in presupposing that a line is made up of points. The path of motion is a line continuously extended in one dimension, but a point has no extension in any dimension. Even if an infinite number of points be set beside one another, we do not obtain the smallest degree of extension. Hence a line is not made up of points, but belongs to a different order altogether. For this reason also a moving body cannot be said to be or not to be at any given point. There are therefore no grounds for alleging it as a, quote, contradiction, that a moving body both is and is not at a particular point. The contradiction between being and non-being supposedly present in becoming, also dwindles on closer examination into nothing. Contradiction would arise only if becoming actually were both being and non-being simpliciter at one and the same time, or exhibited a restricted being and non-being in the same respect. but the former is impossible in becoming, for being simpliciter is infinite being, which cannot become, since it contains no non-being from which it could come into being, i.e. become, while non-being simpliciter is nothing from which nothing can come. Becoming always presupposes a something that becomes. The transition from nothing into being occurs not by way of becoming, but through a creatio ex nihilo, an act of creation. It follows that becoming is possible only when what becomes is being and non-being merely in a certain respect, but in this case it cannot exhibit them both in the same respect, which is the only way in which a contradiction could arise. For the becoming is non-being, in respect of that which lies just ahead of it, and being in respect of what it has already become. It is clear, therefore, that becoming involves no real contradiction between being and non-being, but merely a transition from a relative non-being into a relative being, from the not yet of possibility into the being of relative reality. And this also makes it clear that the source of motion cannot lie in, quote, contradiction. But how does this dialectical materialist thesis fare if the term, quote, contradiction is taken? Not in its commonly accepted sense, as in the law of contradiction, which rules out the possibility that one and the same thing should simultaneously be and not be in the same respect, but in the sense of a, quote, opposition. What is to be said of those pairs of opposites which dialectical materialism produces from the various fields of reality, and by which it attempts, as already noted, to prove that, quote, self-movement is everywhere prevalent in the universe? We shall disregard those examples which may definitely be pronounced ill-chosen, such as the opposition between the north and south poles of a magnet. For here there can be no question of self-movement, but at best only movement from elsewhere. The first thing to be said of this thesis, that all motion in the world is ultimately, quote, self-movement, is that it does not follow, since many of the examples adduced do nothing to prove it. It must further be objected that dialectical materialism does not make it sufficiently clear as to whereabouts in the world we are ultimately to look for that unity of the subject which is presupposed in, quote, self-movement. In the contradictions or oppositions from which motion results are supposed to be internal, and if the motion is taken to proceed from within the subject moved, rather than being evoked in it by an, quote, other, this presupposes that the subject in which motion is thus located represents a substantial unity. Thus, if all motion in the world is to be regarded as, quote, self-movement, this would imply that the world as a whole forms a substantial unity, and that all the things in it not only stand in some sort of relation to one another, thereby forming a unity of system merely, but together constitute the substantial unity of a single subject, and hence that not only the whole of inorganic nature, but organisms also, men included, are not separate entities, but merely various determinations of the one world substance. But does dialectical materialism really wish to maintain this? No definite answer is vouchsafed to this question. There is talk indeed of the, quote, material unity of the world, end quote, but as we have already pointed out, unity here means likeness, merely rather than identity. The thesis of universal connection is also put forward as the first principal feature of the dialectic, but the unity there referred to does not extend beyond a unity of system, in which the various intercoordinated objects retain their substantial individuality, so that the changes they produce in one another do not have the character of, quote, self-movement, but rather of movement from elsewhere, a causal operation of one thing upon another. There is yet a third point to be dealt with. We may begin by leaving it an open question whether and where self-movement occurs in the world, to what extent it may be attributed to the behavior of living organisms, though the external influences of light, air, soil, etc. certainly play an essential part in this, and whether true self-movement is also to be found in inorganic nature, as in radioactive breakdown, for example. But philosophically speaking, one thing is certain. If there can in fact be true self-movement, It assuredly applies only to those changes where no enhancement of being is involved, as in change of position, etc., not to any true process of becoming in the above defined sense of a transition from relative non-being into relative being. By, quote, relative non-being, here we refer to being that in certain respects is already actualized, but in others, i.e. in respect of the perfection of being it is still to attain, is, quote, not yet in being, end quote. Or in dialectical materialist terms, which are also those of Aristotle, is still in a state of, quote, possibility, end quote. Now it is clear that we shall see in the next chapter that this is also the express teaching of dialectical materialism, that the possible cannot become actual of its own accord, since non-being cannot of itself provide the being which it lacks. To maintain otherwise would be to dispense with the causal law and the principle of sufficient reason, which is already shown would amount to intellectual suicide. In this sense, therefore, the old rule still holds good. Everything that moves or changes is moved or changed by something else. Parenthesis, quid movetur ab alio movetur. Parenthesis. It follows from this that though the opposition between being and non-being, conceived as an opposition of the real principles of being, possibility and actuality, certainly makes motion, parenthesis, equal to change, in parenthesis, internally possible, it cannot give rise to the latter. For this purpose we also require the operation of an efficient cause distinct from these two. This leads us to a further conclusion of great importance. Given that this efficient cause in turn is not a being existing from its own inner necessity, but the actualization of a possibility, it points us to a further being to which it is indebted for its emergence from possibility into actuality, and so on. But this chain of dependence cannot be prolonged indefinitely, since otherwise we should nowhere find an origin for this repeated multiplication of being, and that would imply that being in general did not exist. In pursuing this chain of dependence, one must therefore arrive somewhere at a cause which has no need of being lifted into actuality by another cause, since it exists by virtue of its own inner necessity and is pure actuality, pure reality, without intermixture of possibility, and such a cause we describe in fact as the, quote, first mover, or God. In other respects also, philosophical investigation of this key feature of the materialist dialectic will be found to lead us beyond materialism, for a philosophical analysis of this very law shows us, in fact, that there is more in material nature than meets the eye of the materialist, namely being in space and time alone, and that, on the contrary, it must also be presumed to embody ideal principles of being, which are thus essentially inaccessible to all empirical methods of knowledge or to any sort of sensory experience, and hence, though not intellectual in their own being, can only be grasped in intellectual cognition, principles, that is, which go to make up the inner constitution of, quote, matter as it figures in spatio-temporal appearance. That the law of the, quote, unity of opposites, end quote, only makes sense with reference to a sphere of being untrammeled by space and time, and therefore with reference to a sphere of ideal being, has also been noted by Chizevsky in his book Hegel Amongst the Slavs. And Prokofiev likewise draws attention to this fact. If this formula of the unity of opposites is not to be reducible to the banal assertion that, quote, here is one thing, and, quote, there another, quote, now one thing, and, quote, then another, quote, the unity of opposites is possible solely and exclusively. Let's say, quote, the unity of opposites is possible solely and exclusively as a unity outside the bounds of space and time. But given the reality of such a unity, then eo ipso, the possibility of an ideal being is given thereby. Thus the doctrine of the unity of internal opposites, once it is seriously thought out to the bottom, ends by demolishing the entire intellectual system of dialectical materialism. End quote. P. Prokofiev in the article The Crisis in Soviet Philosophy, or the book Crisis in Soviet Philosophy. And this is more than just a matter of chance. For in fact, the law of the unity of opposites is none other than the doctrine, inherited by German idealism, of the coincidentia oppositorum, the core of German mysticism and the philosophy of Nicholas of Cusa, and the starting point of the philosophy of identity, Schelling. There are historical reasons why this doctrine should have found such acceptance, specifically on Russian soil. For idealism here looks back to Neoplatonism, with which the spiritual culture of Russia has long been intimately connected, primarily by way of the Byzantine liturgy, but also through the patristic literature. A fondness for paradox, a strongly developed feeling for the mystery of the world, are frequently to be met with not only in Russian philosophy, but also in the literature and other achievements of the Russian spirit. Chizhevsky makes particular mention of the Areopagitic writings as having been a favorite spiritual text among the Russian people ever since the 14th century. Quote, along with many other ideas, the writings of the Areopagite awakened again and again in the mind of the Russian reader, an awareness of the paradoxical, contradictory, and dynamic quality of the higher forms of being. Through these writings, the Russian reader gained access to the most important of the forerunners of Hegel, Proclus, with his ideas of the dramatic character of true being and the mystical dialectical movement of the spirit. Even the triple rhythm of this dynamic and its counterpart in true being can be extracted by an attentive reader from the Christianized Proclus of the Areopagitica. End quote. D.I. Chizhevsky, in a book titled Hegel in Russia. A strange fate for dialectical materialism, it took refuge in this law of the unity of opposites so as to be able to explain the motion and development of the world from the world itself without appealing to any higher principle, and thereby to, quote, liberate mankind from all, quote, mysticism and religious faith. Quote, the acceptance of self-movement frees us from the idealist notions of a God, a world spirit, a world soul, etc. as the source of motion and development. End quote. I. Ruzimovsky. And yet, in fact, this law lies at the heart of a centuries-old mystical tradition and leads not only to the acknowledgement of ideal principles in the world, but more especially also to the recognition of a first mover, God the Creator, or does so rather, provided only that it is logically followed out to the end, and that philosophy is not compelled, for motives which lie outside philosophy, to shut its eyes and desist from further philosophical inquiry as soon as it runs up against limits of a certain kind. New section, Section 4, the law of the negation of the negation. This doctrine of dialectical materialism has had a checkered history. Engels devoted a whole chapter to it in Anti-Düring. Lenin lists it as numbers 13 and 14 of the 16 elements of the dialectic, and until 1938, negation of the negation also figured in Soviet accounts of dialectical materialism, but for some reason or other it then fell out of favor. Even in Alexandrov's textbook on dialectical materialism, which was not published until after Stalin's death, we still find a somewhat uncertain attitude towards this law. It is mentioned in connection with the thesis as to the upward character of development, but it is emphasized that in Hegel it took an avowedly mystical form, and that Hegel's idealistic dialectic was sharply criticized by Marx and Engels, and hence that when they, too, are frequently found using the expression, quote, negation of the negation, and, quote, its content in their case is essentially different. Nowadays there are open references to a, quote, rehabilitation, end quote, of this law. Vorobiev draws attention to an interesting, quote, evolution, end quote, in its treatment throughout the successive editions of Rosenthal-Euden's Short Philosophical Dictionary. In the first two editions, 1939 to 1940, it is the form of ascending development, motion in a spiral, which constitutes the essence of the law, whereas in the fourth and fifth, the spiral form, has disappeared, and it is the content, ascending development, that is chiefly referred to. Quote, in short, the development proceeds, quote, in Hegelian fashion, quote, from one extreme to the other. To begin with, on account of the form, there is insufficient attention given to the content, and then for the sake of the content, the form is lost sight of. The restoration of the law of the negation at the present day requires that both these one-sided approaches should be overcome. End quote. M.F. Vorobiev. This law can only be understood, however, in the opinion of the Soviet philosophers on the basis of Engels' first two laws, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. The central principle of the materialist dialectic is concerned with the nature and origin of development. The second expresses the form of development as a transition from quantitative to qualitative change, while the third, the law of the negation, relates to the tendency and direction of development. The first tells us why development occurs, the second how, and the third whither it is going. The content of the law of the negation is briefly as follows. The sudden change is a new quality. So, the sudden change to a new quality, as depicted in the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, necessarily implies the negation of the previous quality. But such a negation is not the end of the matter. The new quality also becomes in turn the starting point for a process of development which again leads to its negation. The first negation is, quote, transcended into a new one. Thus the total rhythm of the dialectical process is concluded by the negation of the negation. This law is supposed to show how it is that, despite the negation, the dialectical process of development retains its connection with the past, does not immediately abolish or annihilate what has gone before, does not open up any, quote, metaphysical gulf between past and present. Just as in Hegel, the synthesis represents a, quote, transcending of thesis and antithesis, in the dual meaning of the word, as at once a, quote, supersession and a, quote, conservation, end quote. So likewise in dialectical materialism, the, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, implies no immediate cancellation of the past, but a denial which preserves all that is positive in what had previously been attained. Quote, it is not flat negation, end quote, says Lenin, quote, nor causal, thoughtless negation, nor yet the wavering, doubting negation of the skeptic that is characteristic and essential in dialectic, but negation as a moment of conjunction, as a moment of development in which the positive is conserved, end quote. Lenin. The process of dialectical development therefore takes the form of an ascending spiral. The return to the starting point is in each case only an apparent one. The movement may well appear to be reverting to its starting point, but in reality it invariably regains its original position on a higher level. This peculiarity of dialectical development is numbered by Lenin under items 13 and 14 of his list of the elements of dialectic. Quote, recapitulation of specific traits, features, etc. on the lower level at the higher one, and ... apparent reversion to the old form, negation of the negation, end quote. Lenin. Engels seeks to prove the universality of this law by pointing out numerous examples of such triads in nature and history. The seed grain which falls into the soil and passes away brings forth the plant negation, which in turn produces new seed grains, negation of the negation. Similarly, human society develops from an original state of common ownership in land via private property, negation, to a new type of common ownership under communism, negation of the negation. Engels even claimed to detect a triple rhythm of this sort in the development of human thought, from the original materialism of Greek philosophy, by way of idealism, to dialectical materialism, which is not just a straightforward return to the original materialism, but a return enriched by the positive ideas worked out in the course of the history of philosophy. Lenin applies the same law to an episode in the development of the Russian Social Democratic Party. This is also worth mentioning here, since it typifies the habit frequently observable among Bolshevik writers, of dealing with political questions against a background of philosophical problems. At the London Congress of the party in 1903, at which the discussion, more especially on the first paragraph of the draft party constitution put forward by Lenin and Plekhanov, gave rise to the split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, it was Lenin's opinion that the development of the controversy exhibited the threefold rhythm at work in reality. The disputes on the next paragraph, conditions of party membership, Lenin and Plekhanov were initially in a minority on this issue, became a starting point from which the discussion turned towards other more secondary matters on which Lenin and Plekhanov secured a majority, only to return enriched by the outcome of the whole debate to its original point of departure. Quote, in a word, not only do oats grow according to Hegel, but the Russian Social Democrats wage war among themselves according to Hegel. End quote. Lenin. One step forward, two steps back. Düring had accused Marx of erecting on the basis of this Hegelian law an a priori historical framework in which socioeconomic conclusions were drawn from the Hegelian formula of the negation of the negation. Engels replies to this, quote, it is obvious that in describing any evolutionary process as the negation of the negation, I do not say anything concerning the particular process of development, say for example of the grain of barley from germination to the death of the fruit-bearing plant. For as the integral calculus also is a negation of the negation, if I said anything of the sort, I should only be making the nonsensical statement that the life process of a barley plant was the integral calculus for that matter, that it was socialism. I should only be making this nonsensical statement that the life process of a barley plant was the integral calculus, or, for that matter, that it was socialism. That, however, is what the metaphysicians are constantly trying to impute to dialectics. When I say that all these processes are the negation of the negation, I bring them all together under this one law of motion, and for this very reason I leave out of account the peculiarities of each separate individual process. End quote. Anti-Düring. In Russia, a similar objection to Marxism had been put forward by Mikhailovsky, who insisted against Marx that his arguments for the inevitability of communism were all supported, quote, exclusively on the end of the threefold Hegelian chain, end quote. In Mikhailovsky's in Lenin's what the, quote, friends of the people are and how they fight the Social Democrats, Lenin stresses, quote, that Marx never thought of, quote, proving anything by means of Hegelian triads, that Marx only studied and investigated the real process, and that Marx regarded the conformity of a theory to reality as its only criterion. If, however, it sometimes transpired that the development of any particular social phenomenon conformed with the Hegelian scheme, namely thesis, negation, negation of the negation, there is nothing at all surprising in this, for it is no rare thing in nature generally. End quote. Lenin. After Marx's inversion of the Hegelian dialectic, Lenin no longer regards the triads as having any important part to play. They are merely a, quote, lid and a, quote, skin. Within Soviet philosophy, the mechanists were accused in their day of having interpreted the negation of the negation to signify a restoration of equilibrium. Bukharin, for example, thought of synthesis not as the negation of the negation, but as the, quote, reconciliation of opposites, unquote. Quote, a unifying position in which contradictions are reconciled, end quote. Lenin. Bukharin. The same objection was also brought against, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote. Deberin, for example, having seen in dialectical materialism a reconciliation of empiricism and rationalism. Since the rehabilitation of this law in Soviet philosophy, a number of authors have made very interesting attempts to give it a deeper philosophical meaning. The Leningrad University journal Vestnik Leningradskogo Universiteta devoted the whole philosophical section of its 23rd number in 1956 to an examination of the law. In the essay by M.F. Vorobiev, it is declared to operate in a twofold form, A notable feature of this inquiry is that the author sets out from a statement by a new classic authority, Mao Zedong. Quote, of the two contradictory aspects, one must be the principal and the other secondary. The principal aspect is that which plays the leading role in the contradiction. The quality of a thing is mainly determined by the principal aspect of the contradiction that has taken the dominant position. End quote. Mao Zedong. Thus, in Hegel, for example, the process of coming to be is a unity of being and non-being under the form of being, whereas passing away is a unity of the same determinations under the form of non-being. Mao Zedong infers from this that qualitative change in a thing is bound up with change in the dominant aspect of the contradiction. Vorobiev concludes, in consequence, that in the qualitative leap, the previously dominant aspect becomes subordinate and vice versa, quote, which produces a radical change in the old qualitative determination, and likewise conditions its transition into a new, higher, and thus opposed qualitative determination. End quote. Vorobiev. The leap, therefore, appears in regard to the previous qualitative determination as a negation. Since the latter is an intrinsically contradictory process, a unity of destruction of the old and construction of the new, a twofold phase or moment must be distinguished within it. Destructive and constructive negation. Vorobiev bases this distinction on a passage in Hegel's logic. Quote, here the first negation in general must carefully be distinguished from the second, the negation of the negation, which is concrete and absolute negativity, while the first is only abstract negativity. End quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. This leap of negation, in the unity of its two moments, abstract and concrete negation, represents the intervening link between two qualitative determinations, the transition from the old form to a new form. Vorobiev illustrates this by concrete examples drawn from the history of the Russian Revolution. The dissolution of the old form of marriage and the family led immediately after the revolution to a brief phase of total negation for both, when certain left-wing radical elements wanted to abolish marriage and the family altogether. Quote, in the name of what were held to be genuinely free and truly socialist relations between the sexes, end quote. M.F. Vorobiev. But Vorobiev also thinks he can show that here there is bound to be that apparent reversion to the old, albeit at a new level, which Lenin regards as characteristic of this law. Quote, the result of the leap, as a fundamental qualitative change, is a transition of the object into the object's opposite, and the emergence of a new qualitative determination. The transition of a phenomenon into its opposite not only presupposes a distinction but also an interconnection, a historical continuity, and hence a certain similarity of the higher stage to the lower. End quote. Vorobiev. From this first form of the law, Vorobiev distinguishes a second, in which the mediating factor, the transitional phase, is realized not in the leap merely, but in a particular qualitative determination. This second form exhibits the, quote, reciprocal transition, end quote, of the opposites into one another, as well as the repetition of the initial stage at a higher level. As such, it is the truest and most important form of the law, for here its characteristic feature, the repetition of previous stages on a higher footing, is particularly clearly manifested. Both forms spring out of the character of ascending motion as movement along a spiral. But the first only exhibits individual segments of this spiral, whereas the second embraces it as a whole. The problem of how negation can give rise to a new positive determination also preoccupies the authors of another contribution, Kazakovich and Oblentseva. Following Hegel, they trace this positive determination of the new content to the fact that it results from a determinate denial, the denial of a determinate content. Unlike, quote, metaphysical denial, the dialectical variety does not come from without or originate outside the process in question. Quote, Quote, naked denial is therefore characteristic of metaphysics. Here, quote, not A annihilates, quote, A, but in dialectical denial, quote, not A signifies the next stage of development, which certainly negates, quote, A, but also arises from, quote, A in doing so. Negated and negating are conjoined and mutually conditioned. The one emerges from the other passes over into the one. Socialism emerges from capitalism and could not, as Fourier, for example, maintained, have come into being thousands of years earlier. Capitalism is replaced by socialism in accordance with law. End quote. T.A. Kazakovich and A.G. Obolentseva in an article titled Some Problems Concerning the Law of the Negation of the Negation. Here, too, negation reveals itself not as a destructive factor merely, but also as a factor in the build-up of the new, whereby the old is, quote, transcended and conserved therein. But relying on Lenin's, quote, left-wing communism and infantile disorder, the authors relate this, quote, transcendence not only to the content, but also to the form of such processes, and draw from this an extremely topical conclusion, quote, the problem of utilizing old forms is of exceptional theoretical and practical importance nowadays in regard to the possibility referred to at the 20th Party Congress of utilizing the parliamentary form in the transition from capitalism to socialism, end quote. Elmeyev and Kazakov are also concerned in their way with the problem of how negation can give rise to historical continuity. They find the answer to this into the dialectical doctrine that, quote, a thing does not pass over into any other whatsoever, into any sort of opposite, but into its own opposite. Into its own opposite, end quote. In confirmation, they quote a marginal note from Lenin's philosophical notebooks, quote, very true and important, the, quote, other, as its own other, development into its own opposite, end quote. This doctrine likewise enables the two authors to point a very topical moral. The Soviet professions of coexistence cannot be insincere, and the Soviet Union cannot possibly harbor any of the designs imputed to it for exporting the revolution, since such ideas spring from a, quote, metaphysical conception of negation. Quote, as a process of dialectical negation, the socialist revolution cannot be, quote, exported, end quote, from without. Bracket sick, Gustav A. Vetter, in bracket, but is the outcome of the internal development of capitalism, end quote. In conclusion, 2 points of detail. What is the meaning of the twofold negation in this law? Why is it called the, quote, law of the negation, end quote? Does this duality have any real significance? According to Kazakovich and Obolentseva, it certainly has. For dialectical movement is not a pure negation in which everything that arises promptly disappears again without a trace. In form, the negation of the negation is meant to express the transcendence of the first negation, and in content, the conservation of all that is positive in the previous development. A further question concerning the role of the triad, starting point, negation of the negation, with some sort of reversion to the starting point. According to our authors, all that needs stressing is that nothing can be proved by the triad. Quote, Marxism by no means rejects the triad, but nor is the triad regarded as a universal master key, which can be used to prove everything. As understood in dialectical materialism, the triad is above all an expression of the path of double negation pursued by all natural and social phenomena, as well as our knowledge in the course of their development. The triad reflects the triple rhythm of development. End quote. Kazakevich and Obolentseva. We can enter no further, unfortunately, into all the other ideas to be found in the various contributions to this number of the Leningrad University Journal. Many of them are doubtless the uncommitted opinions of the authors concerned, and the whole controversy was assuredly arranged in advance. But we have sought to present some specimens from these essays in order to give an idea of the breath of fresh air which distinguishes these writings from Leningrad. They have an agreeable freshness, these articles, at last one again has the sense of personal thought, for all their adherence to the basic theses of Marxist-Leninism, which here too is naturally the starting point for philosophizing. One still has the impression that the authors have to some extent succeeded in freeing themselves from the customary stereotype. Even the frequent references back to Hegel are worthy of note. In comparison with Vопроsi Philosophie, one feels that the Leningrad writers have been able to allow themselves to strike out more boldly, whereas the central organ of the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences must naturally be more concerned with upholding the official, quote, line. To be sure, even Vопроsi Philosophie has become a great deal more interesting in the last few years, but in the writings of the Leningrad philosophers one senses, in effect, a different, quote, style. One astonishing thing, however, is the extraordinarily limited circulation of the Vestnik Leningrad's Kogo Universiteta, where Vопроsi Philosophy prints 500,000 copies an issue, and even the Vestnik Moskov Kogo Universiteta, the organ of Moscow University, at least reaches the figure of 3,300. The Leningrad University Journal only runs to 1,810 copies. To return once more to the law of the negation, the first thing that strikes us is that it should again have been hauled out of obscurity since the death of Stalin. The decisive reason for this is quite openly specified in the articles considered above. Quote, the nihilistic attitude towards the science and culture of bourgeois society, which has long been in evidence, was having a negative effect upon the various aspects of our own practical work. The plenum of the Party Central Committee of July 1955 forcibly condemned such an approach to the achievements of the capitalist countries and called for an application of the best of these achievements in the fields of science and technology in the interest of communist construction. End quote. V.Y. Elmayev and A.P. Kazakov. And since such a, quote, nihilistic attitude, end quote, rests upon a denial of continuity and development and betrays a, quote, metaphysical conception of negation, end quote, this law is at present of particularly topical significance. In all this philosophical discussion of the law, the chief interest lies for us in what is said as to the special character of, quote, dialectical negation, whereby our authors seek to explain the upward course of development. Two things are maintained in this connection. Firstly, dialectical negation is supposed to give rise to a new determination, and then, thanks especially to the negation of the negation, to bring about an ascent in development, in that there is no immediate return to the starting point, but rather a repetition of the previous stage of development at a higher level. But is this possible? This must definitely be denied, for in the first place, negation, whether, quote, metaphysical or, quote, dialectical, can do nothing more than negate, and can never produce a new determination on its own account. Negation alone merely leads from, quote, A into the boundless expansion of, quote, not A, but not to determine it, quote, B or, quote, C, etc. When Kazakevich and Obolentseva maintain in their article that in dialectical negation, quote, not A signifies the, quote, next stage in development, end quote, which negates, quote, A, and at the same time arises from A, it is misleading to designate this next stage as, quote, not A, when strictly speaking it should be denoted by a determinate letter of the alphabet, quote, B, or, quote, C, or, quote, E. Moreover, it owes this new determination not to negation, but to the previous determination of, quote, A. It is equally evident that it is not, quote, dialectical negation, which brings about historical continuity, by transforming a thing into, quote, its own, and, quote, opposite. If its, quote, own opposite emerges, this is not the outcome of negation as such, even when qualified to some extent by the little word, quote, dialectical. It is the upshot, rather, of the first determination itself, or also some third thing. This is still more plainly to be seen in the work of Vorobiev, in whose analysis the transition of an object into the object's opposite, the emergence of a new qualitative determination, appears as the result of a, quote, leap of negation, quote. From his own previous analysis founded on Mao Zedong as to how the, quote, leap comes about, it follows that it is not negation as such which gives rise to a new determination, but on the contrary, that both determinations are already present from the beginning, and merely change places as a result of the, quote, leap of negation, quote, the dominant becoming the subordinate, and the subordinate the dominant. We see, therefore, that the new determination is not the product of, quote, negation, but is due to the first determination, or attributable to the action of a third thing. No less arbitrary is the claim that evolution moves upward on the basis of the negation of the negation. Here our first complaint must be that no sort of criterion is provided by which to assess the, quote, lower and the, quote, higher, the repetition of certain features of an already traversed stage of development, plus some new features, does not necessarily imply a move upwards, for it might also represent a purely quantitative increase. So if an ascent should in fact be observable in evolution, some further explanation must be found for this. In point of fact, the, quote, negation of the negation, quote, does not serve to explain even the apparent, quote, reversion in some respect to the old, end quote. The Soviet authors suppose that a development, when twice transformed into its opposite, must again lead back to its starting point. But it is arbitrary to assume that the negation of a determination must necessarily imply its transformation into its opposite. For a determination different from the first might also supervene, which does not require to be the opposite of the first. Whatever sort of determination should happen to replace the first, it would still be a negation of the latter. Hence it is clear that a twofold negation by no means necessarily lands one back at the starting point even at a higher level. This law of the negation therefore provides, at best, a description, in highly general terms, of certain evolutionary processes in the world, but is in no sense an explanation of this evolution, nor yet, as is maintained, an explanation of the, quote, tendency and direction, end quote, of evolution. As with the other three laws of the materialist dialectic already discussed, so here too, we see how questionable is the union of materialism and dialectics. For if the subject of dialectical development is ultimately assumed to be matter, this is to treat the development in question, with its postulated progress from lower to higher, as in the last resort a process unfolding in time. At the outset there is only the poorest kind of being, and only at a later stage does the greater perfection appear. Any sort of proleptic influence on the part of the greater perfection thereby becomes impossible, unless one is prepared to credit the latter with some sort of real pre-existence. But in that case the whole process of development would be an illusion. At the outset, therefore, according to dialectical materialism, we have lifeless and mindless matter, which with the assistance of the, quote, materialist dialectic, end quote, and its three basic laws, is then supposed to conjure up all the higher determinations. Analysis of these laws has shown us, however, that they are none of them equal to this task. The opposition of non-being, possibility, and being, actuality, certainly makes becoming internally possible, but this alone is insufficient to bring it about, even if quantitative changes may be assumed to lead to the emergence of an essentially higher, quote, quality. This too is impossible without a correspondingly higher cause, and the negation of the negation, whether, quote, dialectically or, quote, metaphysically set forth, can never of itself give birth to a new determination, let alone therefore a higher one. If on negation a new determination arises, it is conditioned by the nature of its predecessor, and if it should belong to a higher level of being, the ascent itself is equally unthinkable, without the intervention of a third factor, on a level of being at least as high as that which the, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, is supposed to lead up to. The position of dialectical materialism is essentially more unfavorable, in this respect, than that of Hegel. In Hegel's logic, the unfolding of the idea into its categories is not a temporal process, since on the one hand this process is not external to the idea, as a result thereof, but is preserved and incorporated within it, as part of its own self-realization too. So too, on the other hand, the result of each stage in the process is always present already. But this is not the case with dialectical materialism. Hence, since here it is matter, necessarily bound up with space and time, which figures as the subject of development. The process is a temporal one, and this rules out any sort of pre-existence or proleptic influence of the result upon the process that is yet to come. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 3 of part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Yes, I think I have it in the, it's going to be on this channel, is chapter 14 of the book for purposes of simplicity. Thank you so much for listening.